Section 1 of Handel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Handel by Romain Rolland, translated by Arthur Eaglefield Hall. Preface. Introduction by the editor. Preface. For a proper appreciation of the colossal work of Handel, many years of study and a book of some 200 pages are very insufficient. To treat at all adequately of Handel's life and work needs a whole lifetime in itself, and even the indefatigable and enthusiastic Christender, who devoted his life to this subject, has hardly encompassed the task. I have done what I could. My faults must be excused. This little book does not pretend to be anything more than a very brief sketch of the life and technique of Handel. I hope to study his character, his work, and his times more in detail in another volume. Romain Rolland. Introduction by the editor. Here in England, we are supposed to know our Handel by heart, but it is doubtful whether we do. Who can say from memory the titles of even 6 of his 39 operas, from whence may be culled many of his choicest flowers of melody? Monsieur Rolland rightly emphasizes the importance of the operas of Handel in the long chain of musical evolution, and it seems impossible for anyone to lay down his book without having a more all-around impression than heretofore of this giant among composers. Monsieur Saint-Saëns once compared the position of a conductor in front of the score of a Handel oratorio to that of a man who sought to settle with his family in some old mansion which has been uninhabited for centuries. The music was different altogether from that to which he was accustomed. No nuances, no bowing, frequently no indication of rate, and often merely a sketched-in bass. Tradition only could guide him, and the English, who alone could have preserved this, he considers, have lost it. Can it be recovered to any extent, and, if so, how? Behind each towering figure of genius are to be found numbers of eloquent men who prepared the way for him, and amongst these precursors there is frequently discovered one who exercised a dominating influence over the young budding genius. Such an influence was exercised by Zachau on Handel, and Monsieur Rolland rightly gives due importance to the consideration of this old master's teachings and compositions, a careful study of which should go far to supplying the right key to Handel's music. One of the great shortcomings in the general musical listener is a lack of the historical view of music. It is a long cry from Bach and Handel to Debussy and Scriabin, but we shall be all the better for looking well at both ends of the long musical chain which connects the unvoiced expression of the past with the vague yet certain hopes of the future. No doubt we have hardly yet recovered from the false position into which we have all helped to place Handel. He was never the great church composer, which has been assumed for so long. Perhaps, rather, he leaned to the pagan side of life in his art. As Mr. Streatfeild says, you can no more call the Messiah a work of art than you can call the Book of Common Prayer popular as a masterpiece of literature. Handel the preacher is laid forever in the tomb, but Handel the artist, with his all-embracing sympathy for human things and his delight in the world around him, lives forevermore. Handel has been greatly, almost willfully, misrepresented, but he has played too great a part in the history of English music to be cast aside on this account. It is true that there are many difficulties in the way of a clearer understanding of his music. A 200 years overgrowth of vain vocal traditions is not going to be torn away in the space of a few years. If the operas have been overlooked in favor of the oratorios, then his instrumental music has been even more neglected on account of the preponderance of his vocal movements. In a recent important contribution to Handelian biography, only a few pages are given to the instrumental works. In this respect, Monsieur Rolland's clear and critical biography fills in a distinct hiatus. Moreover, Handel sojourned in Germany, Italy, finally, and longest in England, but never in France. M. Rolland, therefore, a Frenchman and the author of that brilliant work, Histoire de l'Opéra en Europe, avant Lully et Scarlatti, may, more than any other writer, be expected to bring a freshness of vision and an impartial judgment to bear on Handel's works. And he has not disappointed us. A.E.H. End of section 1. Section 2 of Handel by Romain Rolland, translated by Arthur Eaglefield Hull. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. George Frederick Handel, His Life, Part 1. George Frederick Handel, His Life. The Handel family was of Silesian origin. The grandfather, Valentine Handel, was a master coppersmith at Breslau. The father, George Handel, was a barber surgeon, originally attached to the service of the armies of Saxony, then of Sweden, later of the French emperor, and finally in the private service of Duke Augustus of Saxony. He was very rich, and purchased at Halle in 1665 a beautiful house, which is still in existence. He was married twice. In 1643 he married a widow of a barber, who was 10 years older than himself. He had 6 children by her, and in 1683 the daughter of a pastor, who was 30 years younger than he was. He had 4 children by her, of which the second was George Frederick. Both parents sprang from that good old bourgeois stock of the 17th century, which was such excellent soil for genius and for faith. Handel, the surgeon, was a man of gigantic stature, serious, severe, energetic, religiously attached to duty, upright, and affable in his dealings with those around him. His portrait exhibits a large, clean-shaven face, which has the impression of one who never smiled. The head is carried high, the eyes morose, prominent nose, and a pleasant but obstinate mouth. Long hair with white curls falling on his shoulders, black cap, collar of lace, and coat of black satin. The aspect of a parliamentary man of his time. The mother was no less sturdy a character, of a clerical family on the maternal side as well as on the paternal side, with a spirit imbued with the Bible. She had a calm courage, which came out prominently when the country was ravaged by pestilence. Her sister and her elder brother were both carried off by the plague. Her father was also affected. She refused to leave them and remained quietly at home. She was then engaged to be married. This sturdy couple transmitted to their distinguished son, in place of good looks, which he certainly had not, and which never disquieted him, their physical and moral health, their stature, their keen intelligence and common sense, their application to work, and the indestructible essence of their quiet, calm spirit. George Frederick Handel was born at Halle on Monday, February 23, 1685. His father was then 63 years, and his mother 34. The town of Halle occupied a singular political situation. It belonged originally to the Elector of Saxony by the treaties of Westphalia. It was ceded to the Elector of Brandenburg, but it paid tribute to the Duke Augustus of Saxony during his lifetime. After the death of Augustus in 1680, Halle passed definitely to Brandenburg, and in 1681 the Grand Elector came to receive homage there. Handel then was born a Prussian, but his father was in the service of the Duke of Saxony, and he retained relationship with the son of Augustus, Johann Adolf, who moved his court after the Prussian annexation to the neighboring town of Weissenfels. Thus, the childhood of Handel was influenced by 2 intellectual forces, the Saxon and the Prussian. Of the two, the more aristocratic, and also the more powerful, was the Saxon. Most of the artists had emigrated with the Duke to Weissenfels. It was there that the genial Heinrich Schütz was born and died. It was there that Handel found his first impetus, and where the calling of the child was first recognized. The precocious musical tendencies of the little George Frederick were somewhat curbed by the formal opposition of his father. The sturdy surgeon had more than objection. He possessed an aversion to the profession of artist. This sentiment was shared by nearly all the sturdy men of Germany. The calling of musician was degraded by the unedifying spectacle of many artists in the years of relaxation which followed the 30 Years' War. Besides which, the bourgeois German of the 17th century had a very different idea of music from that of our French middle classes of the 19th century. It was with them a mere art of amusement and not a serious profession. Many of the masters of that time, Schütz, Rosenmüller, Kuhnau, were lawyers or theologians before they devoted themselves to music, or they even followed for a time the two professions. Handel's father wished his son to follow his own profession, that of law, but a journey to Weissenfels overcame all his objections. The Duke heard the little 7-year-old Handel play the organ, with the result that he sent for the father to see him and recommended him not to thwart the child's obvious musical talents. The father, who had always taken these counsels very badly when they came from anyone else, doubtless appreciated them when they came from the lips of a prince. And without renouncing his own right over his son, for he still had the legal plan in his head, consented to let him learn music. And on his return to Halle, he placed him under the best master in the town, the organist Friedrich Wilhelm Zachau. Zachau was a broad-minded man, and moreover a good musician, whose greatness was only appreciated many years after his death. His influence on Handel was splendid. Handel himself did not conceal it. This influence affected the pupil in two ways, by his method of teaching and by his artistic personality. The man was very well up in his art, says Matheson, and is possessed of as much talent as beneficence. Handel's devotion to Zachau was so great that he seemed never able to show him sufficient affection and kindness. The master's first efforts were devoted to giving the pupil a strong foundation in harmony. Then he turned his thoughts towards the inventive side of the art. He showed him how to give his musical ideas the most perfect form, and he refined his taste. He possessed a remarkable library of Italian and German music, and he explained to Handel the various methods of writing and composing adopted by different nationalities, whilst pointing out the good qualities and the faults of each composer. And in order that his education might be at the same time theoretical and practical, he frequently gave him exercises to work in such and such a style. This education, with a true European catholicity, was not confined to one particular musical style, but spread itself out over all schools, and caused him to assimilate the best points of all. For who can fail to see that the conception and practice of Handel, and indeed the very essence of his genius, was the absorption of 100 different styles? One of his manuscripts, dated 1698, and preserved carefully all his life, contains, so says Crescender, some airs, choruses, capriccios, and fugues of Zachau, Alberti, Heinrich Albert, Froberger, Krieger, Carol, Ebner, Strunk, which he had copied out whilst studying with Zachau. Handel could never forget these old masters, distinct traces of whom are found from time to time in his best-known works. He would doubtless, too, with Zachau, have seen the first volumes of the clavier works of Kuhnau, which were published at that time. Moreover, it seems that Zachau knew the work of Agostino Steffani, who later on took a fatherly interest in Handel, and Zachau followed sympathetically the dramatic musical movement in Hamburg. Thus the little Handel had, thanks to his master, a living summary of the musical resources of Germany, old and new, and under his direction he absorbed all the secrets of the great contrapuntal architects of the past, together with the clear, expressive, and melodic beauty of the Italian-German schools of Hanover and Hamburg. But the personal influence of the character and the art of Zachau reacted no less strongly on Handel than did his methods of instruction. One is struck by the relationship of his works to those of Handel. They are similar in character and style. Their reminiscences of motifs, figures, and of subjects count for little. There is the same essence in the art of both master and pupil. There is the same feeling of light and joy. There is nothing of the pious concentration and introspection of Bach, who goes down into the deeps of thought and who loves to probe into all the innermost recesses of the heart and, in silence and solitude, converse with his God. The music of Zachau is the music of great spaces, of dazzling frescoes, such as one sees on the domes of the Italian cathedrals of the 16th and 17th centuries. But Zachau's work contains more religion than these. His music pulses with action like the bounding and rebounding of great springs of steel. It has triumphant subjects with expositions of great solemnity. There are victorious marches, carrying everything before them, which go crashing on without stopping, ever spurring on the sparkling and joyous patterns. There are also pastoral themes, pure and voluptuous reveries, dances, and songs accompanied by flutes with a Grecian perfume and a smiling virtuosity, a joy intoxicated with itself, twisting lines and vocal arabesques, vocalizations, trills for the voice, which gambol light-heartedly with the little wave-like arpeggios of the violins. Let us unite these two traits, the heroic and the pastoral, the warriors' marches, and the jubilant dances. There you have the Handelian tableau, the people of Israel and the women dancing before the victorious army. You find in Zachau a sketch for the monumental constructions of Handel in his Hallelujahs, those mountains of sound which resound their joy, the colossal amens which crown his oratorios like the dome of St. Peter at Rome. Add to this also Zachau's marked liking for instrumental music, which makes him combine it so happily with the vocal solos, and very often he imagines the voice as an instrument which combines and gambols with the other instruments, thus forming a decorative garland harmoniously woven. To sum up, it was an art less intimate than expansive, an art newly born, not devoid of emotion though, but above all restful, strong, and happy, and optimistic music like that of Handel. Truly Handel in miniature, with much less breadth, less richness of invention, and particularly a smaller power of development. There is nothing of the attractiveness of Handel's colossal movements, like an army which marches and sings, and more solid strength is necessary to carry the weight right to the end without bending. Zachau flinches on his way. He has not the vital force of Handel, but in compensation he has more naivete, more tender candor, more of the childlike chasteness and evangelic grace. Certainly there we have the master really necessary to Handel, a master more than one great man had the good fortune to find. It is Giovanni Santi for Raphael. It is Neef for Beethoven. Good, simple, straightforward, a little dull, but giving a steady and gentle light, where the youth may dream in peace and abandon himself with confidence to a guide almost fraternal, who does not seek to dominate him, but rather strives to fan the little flame into a greater fire, to turn the little rivulet of music into the mighty river of genius. Whilst studying with Zachau, the young Handel visited Berlin. After having paid his homage to his former master, the Elector of Saxony, he was wise enough also to present himself to the new one, the Elector of Brandenburg. It seems that this journey took place about 1696, when the boy was 11 years old, and his father, being ill, did not accompany him. The Berlin court lived a very short life of artistic brilliance between the wars of the Grand Elector and those of the Prince Regent. Music was greatly in honor, thanks to the Electress Sophia Charlotte, daughter of the celebrated Sophia of Hanover. She attracted to her the best Italian instrumentalists, singers, and composers. She founded the Berlin Opera and even conducted several concerts at court. Doubtless the movement was but superficial. It was only held together by the impulse of the Electress, who had more spirit than earnestness. Art was for her only a fond distraction, so that after her death the musical fêtes in Berlin became extinct. But it was something to have lighted, only for a brief hour, this flame of beautiful Italian art, and it was thus that the little Handel came into contact for the first time with the music of the South. The child who displayed his powers on the clavecin before a princely audience had so much success that the Elector of Brandenburg wished him to enter his service. He offered Handel's father to send the child to Italy to finish his studies. The old man refused. He had a stubborn pride and did not desire, so his Mainwaring, that his son should be tied too soon to a prince. He wished to see his child again, as he considered that he himself might die at any moment. Little Handel returned too late. He learnt en route that his father had died on February 11th, 1697. The principal obstacle in the way of his musical vocation had now disappeared, but he had so profound a respect for his father's wishes that he forced himself to study law for many more years. After having completed in due course his classes at the college, he was entered for the faculty of law at the University of Halle on February 10th, 1702, 5 years after his father's death. University life in Halle at that time was of a revolting character, but, in spite of this, an intense life of thought and religion was also to be found there. The faculty of theology was the center of pietism. The students devoted themselves to religious exercises which led to ecstasy. Handel, independent as he always was, kept clear of the brutal amusements, just as he did of the mystic contemplation. He was religious without being sentimental. For the rest, an artist could only listen to the pietists with difficulty, for the religious devotion was too often oppressive to art. Even J.S. Bach, pietist at heart, by his public acts declared himself opposed to the pietists, who were on certain marked occasions inimical to music. For a still stronger reason, Handel had no leaning towards mysticism. Religion was not his business. Law certainly was not. However, he had for his master the most remarkable professor in Germany, Christian Thomasius, the advocate in the arraignment of witchcraft, the reformer of the teaching of law, who himself made a thorough study of German customs, and who did not cease to make battle with the gross and stupid abuses of the universities, with their spirit of caste, pedantry, ignorance, hypocrisy, and judicial and religious acerbity. If such a training was not of the nature to retain Handel, it was certainly not the fault of the professor. There were no more vital lessons in the whole of the Germany of that day, none which offered a more fruitful field of activity to a young man. Let us be sure that a Beethoven would not have been insensible to them, but Handel was a pure musician. He was music itself. Nothing else could occupy his thoughts. In the year in which he had completed his terms in the Faculty of Law, he found a post of organist at Halle, and in a church more than strictly Lutheran, being of the Reformed order, where the organist had expressly to conform to the new cult. However, he was only 17 years old. This simple fact showed what musical authority he already exercised in the town where he had studied law. Not only was he organist, but he was also professor at the College of the Reformists. He took vocal music there for 2 hours every week. He selected the most gifted of his pupils and formed from them a vocal and instrumental body, which was to be heard every Sunday in one church or another of the town. He included in his musical repertoire chorales, psalms, motets, cantatas, which were changed every Sunday. Truly an excellent school for learning to write quickly and well. Handel there formed his creative fecundity. Of hundreds of cantatas which he then wrote, none were preserved by him, but it is certain that his memory retained more than one idea to serve in later compositions, for he never lost anything, and from that time for the rest of his life he retained in his mind his earlier musical ideas. This should not be attributed to his speed in working, but to the unity of his thought and his strenuous search for perfection. Handel renewed neither his yearly engagement at the Cathedral of Halle nor at the university. In his period as organist he had gauged his own musical force, and he no longer wished to constrain it. A wider field of activity was necessary. He quitted Halle in the spring of 1703, and guided both by his instincts and by a preference of his master Zachau, he betook himself to Hamburg, the city of German opera. Hamburg was the Venice of Germany, a free town far from the noise of wars, a refuge of artists and people of large fortunes, the center of the commerce of northern Europe, a cosmopolitan city where they spoke all languages, and especially the French tongue. It was in continual relationship with both England and Italy, and particularly with Venice, which constituted for it a model for emulation. It was by way of Hamburg that the English ideas were circulated in Germany. It was there where the first German newspapers appeared. In the time of Handel, Hamburg shared with Leipzig the intellectual prestige of Germany. There was no other place in Germany where music was held in such high esteem. The artists there hobnobbed with the rich merchants. Christoph, pupil of Schütz, had founded there a celebrated Collegium Musicum, a society of musicians, and started there in 1677-8, the first theater of German opera. It was not a princely opera open only to those invited by the prince, but a public opera, popular in spirit and in prices. It was the example of Italy, notably that of Venice, which called forth this foundation, but the spirits of the two theaters were very different. Whilst that of Venice satisfied itself with fantastic melodramas curiously devised from the ancient mythology and history, the Hamburg opera retained, despite the grossness of taste and licentiousness of manners, an old religious foundation. The Hamburg opera was inaugurated in 1678 by the production of Johann Tylers' Creation of the World. The composer was a pupil of Schütz. From 1678 to 1692, a large number of religious dramas were given there, some of an allegorical character, others inspired by the Bible. In certain of these subjects, one can already see the future oratorios of Handel. Feeble as these pieces were, they were yet on the definite road for the founding of a real German theater. It seems to have been the idea of one of these poets, Pastor Elmenhorst, who wished to give to the religious opera the value of a classic form of art. Unfortunately, the public spirit was on the decline. Its religious resources, however, were well protected, save in a minority where religion took a more aggressive character, as it felt itself less able to hold people. There were two factions in the Hamburg public. One, the most numerous, whom religion bored, and who wished to amuse themselves at the theater. The other party was religious, and would not have anything to do with the opera under the impression that it was a work of Satan, opera diabolica. The struggle was warmly contested between the two factions, and religious opera came to grief. The last representation took place in 1692. When Handel arrived, it was truly the opera diabolica, which ran with its many extravagances and its licentious habits. I have told elsewhere the story of this period of theatrical history in Hamburg, of which the golden age was certainly between 1692 and 1703. Many conditions contributed to the establishment of a good theater and opera at Hamburg, money and the wealthy patrons disposed to expend it. An excellent band of instruments, good but small in number, a scenic art well advanced, a luxury of decoration and machinery, renowned poets, musicians of great value, and rarest of all, the poets and musicians who assembled from die sich wohl verstanden, as Matheson wrote. The poets were named Bresson of Wolfenbüttel, who was inspired by the French theater, and Christian Postel, whom Crisander calls very complacently a German Metastasio. The feeblest part was the singing. For a long time, the Hamburg Opera had no professional singers. The roles were taken by students and artisans, by shoemakers, tailors, fruiterers, and girls of little talent and less virtue. Generally, the artisans found it more convenient themselves to take the female roles. Men and women alike had a profound ignorance of music. Towards 1693, the opera at Hamburg was fortunately completely transformed from top to bottom by the great Kapellmeister Sigismund Kusser, who introduced reforms in the orchestra after the French model and in the singing on Italian lines. France was represented in his eyes, as for all foreign musicians, by the personage of Lully, by whom Kusser was trained for 6 years in Paris. Italy was represented by a remarkable artist settled at Hanover from 1689 to 1696, who produced 10 operas, Agostino Steffani, from the province of Venice. This dual model from Italy and France, aided by the personal example of Kusser, played the chief part in producing the best musician of the Hamburg Opera, Reinhard Kaiser, a man who, despite his character and presumptuous knowledge, had certainly genius. Kaiser was under 30 years old when Handel arrived, but he was then at the zenith of his fame. Kapellmeister of the Hamburg Opera since 1695, then director of the theater since the end of 1702, very highly gifted, but of scanty culture, dissipated, voluptuous, careless. He was the incontestable ruler of the German opera, the artist type of that epoch, overflowing with material life and devoting itself to the love of pleasure. The influence of both Lully and that of Steffani is shown in his first operas, but his own personality is easily recognizable under these traces of borrowing. He has a very fine sense of instrumental color, widely differing from that of the followers of Lully, who were a little disdainful of expressive power in the orchestra, and were always disposed to sacrifice it to the primacy of the voice. He believed, as did his admirer and commentator Matheson, that one can express the feelings by means of the orchestra alone. He was, moreover, a true master of recitative. One might say that he created the German recitative. He attached extreme importance to it, saying that the expression in recitative often gave the intelligent composer much more trouble than the invention of the air. He sought to note with exactitude, accent, punctuation, the living breath itself, without sacrificing anything of the musical beauty. His recitative arioso takes an intermediate place between the oratorical recitative of the French and the recitative secco of the Italians, and was one of the models for the recitative of J.S. Bach. And even not accepting Bach and Handel, Matheson persists in seeing in Kaiser the master of this style. But the real supreme gift of Kaiser was his melodic invention, in that he was one of the first artists in Germany, and the Mozart of the first part of the 18th century. He had an abundant and winning inspiration. As Matheson said, his true nature was tenderness, love. From the commencement to the end of his career, he could produce voluptuous feelings with such exquisite art that no one could surpass him. His melodic style, much more advanced than that of Handel, not only at this particular epoch, but at any moment of his life, is free, unsophisticated, and happy. It is not the contrapuntal style of Handelian opera, but it inclines rather to that of Hasse, who was trained entirely in it, to the symphonists of Mannheim, and to Mozart. Never has Handel, greater and more perfect as he was, possessed the exquisite note which breathes in the melodies of Kaiser, that fresh perfume of the simple flower of the field. Kaiser had the taste for popular songs and rustic scenes, but he knew also how to rise to the very summits of classical tragedy. and some of his airs of stately grief might have been written by Handel himself. Kaiser was then full of lessons and of models for Handel, who was not slow to take them, but he also set him several bad examples too. The worst was the renunciation of the national language. Whilst Postel and Schott had been at the head of the Hamburg Opera, the Italian language had been kept within bounds, but since Kaiser had become director, he had changed all that. In his Claudius, 1703, he made the first barbarous attempt at a mixture of Italian and German languages. It was for him a pure fanfare of virtuosity, and he wished to show, as he explained in his preface, that he was capable of beating the Italians on their own ground. He took no account of the detriment to German opera. Handel, following his example, mixes in his first operas the airs with Italian words with those set to German words. Since that time he no longer wrote Italian operas, and after that his musical theatre was without foundation and without public. The sanction of this error resulted in Germany's neglect of Kaiser's operas and even of those of Handel, despite the genius of both composers. Handel arrived at Hamburg during the summer of 1703. One can imagine him there at that time of life as in the portrait painted by Thornhill, which is in the Fitzwilliam Museum at Cambridge. A long face, calm but a little coarse, large and serious eyes, large and straight nose, ample forehead, vigorous mouth with thick lips, cheeks and chin already full, very straight head without wig, and covered with a biretta after the manner of Wagner. He was rich in power and strong in will, says Mattheson, who, by the way, was the first acquaintance he made in Hamburg. Mattheson, who was then 22, 4 years older than Handel, came from a rich Hamburg family and possessed vast knowledge. He spoke English, Italian, French, was trained for the law, well grounded in music, could play nearly all the instruments, and wrote operas of which he was the poet, the composer, and the actor all in one. Above all, he was a master theorist and the most energetic critic of German music. With an immense amour-propre and many passionate dislikes, he had a robust spirit, very sound and very honest, a sort of Boileau or of Lessing, a music half a century before La Dramaturgie. On the one side, he combated scholastic routine and abstract science in the name of nature, and laid down the rule that music is that which sounds well. Musik müsse schön klingen. He played his part in the banishment of the obsolete theories, psalmization, ecclesiastical modes, and the definition of our modern system. On the other hand, he was a champion of German art and German spirit. From Lessing he derived his patriotism, his rough independence, his impetuosity, which seemed to possess a violence almost brutal. All his books cry Fuori Barbari. One of his works was entitled The Musical Patriot, Der musikalische Patriot, 1728. In 1722 he founded the first German musical journal, Critica Musica, and all his life he waged a vigorous war for good sense, real musical intelligence, music which speaks to the heart and not to the ear, moving and strengthening the soul of the intelligent man with beautiful thoughts and melodies. He saw in music a religious idea. By his wide culture, his knowledge of the artistic theories of the past, his familiarity with all the important French and Italian works, his relationships with the principal German masters, with Kaiser, Handel, J.S. Bach, by his rich practical experience, his acute critical sense, his ardent patriotism, his virile and flowing language, he was well fitted to be the great musical educator of Germany, and he accomplished his task well. In the dispersion of German artists which took place then, in addition to the many vicissitudes of their work, there was chiefly lacking a support of political solidarity, which could cause music to rise above the fluctuations of the tastes of little towns and the small coteries. Mattheson was then for half a century the sole tribune of German music. The intellect, where thoughts concentrated from all quarters, and from him radiated an influence over all the country in return. It was thus that he preserved the ideas of Kaiser, which apart from him would have fallen into oblivion, without leaving any traces of their existence. It was these traces that he rescued out of the debacle and preserved for us a multitude of imperishable souvenirs for the musical history of the 18th century, which Matheson gathered together and published in his monumental Forte. He acted powerfully on his times. His books laid down the law for the Kapellmeisters, the cantors, the organists, and the teachers. His criticisms, his advice on style and singing, on gesture and acting, were no less efficacious. He possessed the real theater feeling. He expected life in the stage action, attaching considerable importance to the pantomime, which is a silent music. He waged war against the impossible action and the want of intelligence amongst the German singers and choralists. And he desired that the composer should think always in writing of the action of the player. The knowledge of facial expression by the actors on the stage, says he, can often be a source of good musical ideas. This is indeed the language of a true man of the theater. For the rest, Matheson was too good a musician to serve music in words. He sought to unite them by safeguarding the independence of both, but ended by giving the preference to the soul over the body, the melody over the words. The words he wrote are the body of the discourses. The thoughts are the soul. The melody is the sun shining on the soul, the marvelous atmosphere which envelops it all. We have said enough to give some idea of this great critic, intelligent and intrepid, who, with many faults, has yet many virtues. One will see how important it was to the young Handel to meet such a guide, even though they were both too original and too self-sufficient for the association to last long. End of section 2. Section 3 of Handel by Romain Rolland, translated by Arthur Eaglefield Hull. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. George Frederick Handel, His Life, Part 2. George Frederick Handel, His Life. Matheson did Handel the honors of Hamburg. He introduced him at the opera and the concerts, and it was through him that Handel entered for the first time into negotiations with England, which was to become his second country. They helped one another mutually. Handel had already an exceptional power on the organ, and in fugue and counterpoint, above all, in improvisation. He shared his knowledge with Matheson, who in return helped him to perfect his melodic style. Matheson believed him to be a very feeble melodist. He wrote his melodies at that time, "O long, long, long," sehr lange, lange Arien, and cantatas without end, which had neither ability nor good taste, but perfect harmony. It is very remarkable that melody was not a natural gift with Handel, for he now appears to us as a melodic genius. It is not necessary to believe that the simple, beautiful melodies rushed forth without effort from his brain. The melodies of Beethoven, which seem the most spontaneous, cost him years of thoughtful work, during which he brooded continually over them, and so Handel also only came to his full power of melodic expression after years of severe discipline, where he learnt as an apprentice sculptor to model beautiful forms and to leave them neither complex nor unfinished. Handel and Matheson spent several months in intimate friendship. Handel joined Matheson at table for meals, and in July and August 1703 they made a journey together to Lübeck to hear the renowned organist Dietrich Buxtehude. Buxtehude had thoughts of retiring and was looking for a successor. The two young men were greatly affected by his talent, but they did not care to succeed him in the post, for it was necessary to wed his daughter, to have his organ, and, said Matheson, neither of them wanted her. 2 years later, they would have met on the road to Lübeck, a young musician also going, like them, to pay Buxtehude a visit, not like them, however, in a carriage, but more humbly on foot. J.S. Bach. Nothing makes us realize the importance of Buxtehude in German music better than this magnet-like attraction which he exercised over the German musicians of the 18th century. Perrault has remarked at some length his influence on the organ style of J.S. Bach. I consider that it was no less marked, though quite different, on the oratorio style of Handel. Buxtehude gave at St. Mary's Church, Lübeck, his celebrated Abendmusiken evening concerts, which took place on Sundays from St. Martin's Day to Christmas by the request of the merchants' guilds at Lübeck, which occupied themselves keenly with music. His cantatas, of which the number is considerable, were all composed for these occasions. Writing for a concert public, and not for a religious service, he felt the need of making his music of a kind which would appeal to everyone. Handel later on found himself in similar circumstances, and the same need led them both to a similar technique. Buxtehude avoided in his music the ornate and clustering polyphony, which was really his métier. He sought nothing but clear, pleasing, and striking designs, and even aimed at descriptive music. He willingly sacrificed himself by intensifying his expression, and what he lost in abundance he gained in power. The homophonic character of his writing, the neatness of his beautiful melodic designs of a popular clarity, the insistence of the rhythms, and the repetition of phrases which sink down into the heart in so obsessive a manner are all essentially Handelian traits. No less is the magnificent triumph of the ensembles, his manner of painting in bold masses of light and shade. It is to a very high degree, as with the art of Handel, music for everyone. But much time passed before Handel profited by the examples of Buxtehude. On his return from Lübeck, he seems to have forgotten them. It was not so, however, for nothing was ever lost on him. At the end of August 1703, Handel entered the Hamburg Orchestra as a second violinist. He loved to amuse himself amongst his kind, and he often made himself appear more ignorant than he was. He behaved, said Mattheson, as if he did not even know how to count 5, for he was a dry stick. That year at Hamburg, Reiser's Claudius was given at the opera, and many of the phrases registered themselves in Handel's marvelous memory. When the season was finished, Mattheson made a journey to Holland, and Handel profited by the absence of his young adviser to assert his own individuality. He had made the acquaintance of the poet Postel, who, old, ill, and troubled by religious scruples, had given up the writing of opera libretti, and no longer wished to compose anything but sacred works. Postel furnished Handel with the text for A Passion According to St. John, which Handel set to music, and performed during Holy Week in 1704. Mattheson, piqued at the volte-face which had happened in his relationship with Handel, criticized the music severely, but not unjustly. Despite the intense feeling of certain pages and the fine dramatic nature of the choruses, the work was uneven and occasionally lacked good taste. From this moment, the friendship between Handel and Mattheson was finished. Handel became conscious of his own genius and could no longer stand the protectorship of Mattheson. Other occurrences aggravated the misunderstanding, which ended in a quarrel, which narrowly escaped a fatal issue. Following the altercation at the opera on December 5, 1704, they fought a duel in the marketplace at Hamburg, and Handel only escaped being killed by a stroke of luck, for Mattheson's sword snapped on a large metal button on Handel's coat, after which they embraced, and the two companions, reconciled by Kaiser, took part together in the rehearsals of Almira, the first opera of Handel. The first representation took place on January 8, 1705, and the work was a brilliant success. A second opera of Handel, Nero, was played on February 25 following, but it had not quite the success of Almira. Handel himself occupied the placards of the opera during the whole of the winter season. It was a fine debut. too fine indeed, and Kaiser became jealous of him. The Hamburg opera, however, was gradually waning. Kaiser gaily led it to its ruin. He led the life of a gay libertine, and all the artists around him rivaled him in his follies. Alone Handel held aloof from the follies, working hard and spending only what was barely necessary. After the success of these two operas, he resigned his post as second violin and clavecinist to the orchestra, but continued to give lessons, and his reputation as a composer kept pace with that of his teaching. Kaiser was uneasy. Handel's increasing reputation aroused his amour-propre. Nothing was more stupid, however, than his jealousy. He was director of the opera, and it was in his interest to give those pieces which were written by popular composers and to maintain relationships with successful composers. But jealousy knows no reason. He reset Elmira and Nero to music in order to put Handel out of joint, and as he had not the opportunity of publishing his opera in toto, he hastily printed the most taking solos from each. But however quickly he went, his downfall followed faster. Before the volume of his opera airs appeared, he had to fly. This was in the end of 1706. Handel and he were destined never to meet again. Kaiser having brought disaster to the Hamburg Opera, there was nothing left to keep Handel in that city. The direction of the theater had fallen into the hands of a Philistine, who, to make money, played musical farces. He certainly commissioned Handel for the opera Florindo and Daphne, but he mutilated the work on his presentation for fear, so he said in the preface of the libretto, that the music might tire the hearers, and lest the public should find the work too serious, he intersected it with a farce in Low German, Die lustige Hochzeit, the joyous wedding. One can well understand that Handel was little interested in his piece so disfigured, and that he did not himself attend the production, but quitted Hamburg. It was about the autumn of 1706 that he made the journey to Italy. It was not, however, that Italy particularly attracted him. Strange to say, it is not unique in the history of art, this man, who was later on to be caught by the fascination of Italy and secure an European musical triumph in the beautiful Italian style, had then a very strong repugnance for the foreign art. When Elmira was being given, he made the acquaintance of the Italian prince Giovanni Gastone dei Medici, brother of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. He was astonished that Handel interested himself so little in the Italian musicians, and bought him a collection of their best works, offering to take him to Florence to hear them performed. But Handel refused, saying that he could find nothing in these works which deserved the prince's eulogies, and that angels would be necessary to sing them in order to make such mediocre things sound even agreeable. This disdain of Italy was not peculiar to Handel. It characterized his generation, and above all, the cult of German musicians who lived at Hamburg. Before then, and later on, the fascination of Italy took hold of Germany. Even Hassler, Schütz, Hasse, Gluck, and Mozart made long and earnest pilgrimages to that country. But on the other hand, J.S. Bach, Kaiser, Matheson, and Telemann never went there. The Hamburg musicians truly wished to assimilate the Italian art, but they never wished to place themselves under the thraldom of the Italian school. They had the laudable ambition of creating a German style independent of foreign influences. Handel shared these great hopes, sustained for a time by the theater at Hamburg. But the sudden collapse of this theater made him see little ground on which to build up the taste of the musical public in Germany, and against his own inclinations he turned his eyes towards that habitual refuge of German artists, Italy, which the older ones so affected to disdain, that country where music expanded itself in the sun, where it was not cheated out of its right of existence as with the Hamburg pietists. It flourished in all the Italian cities and in all classes of Italian society, with the transports of love, and all around it was an efflorescence of the other arts, a superior civilization, a life smiling and radiant, of which Handel had some foretaste in his dealings with the Italian nobles who passed through Hamburg. He departed. His leaving was so brusque that his friends knew nothing of it. He did not even say goodbye to Matheson. The period at which he arrived in Italy was not the most fortunate. The war for the Spanish succession was in full swing, and Handel met at Venice in the winter of 1706 Prince Eugene and his staff major, who were resting after the victorious campaign in Lombardy. He did not stay there, but went right on to Florence, where he remained till the end of the year. Doubtless he bore these offers of protection in mind, which the Prince Gaston de Medici had made him. Was such protection as useful to Handel as he had hoped? One may be allowed to doubt it. In truth, the son of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinand, was a musician. He played the clavier well. He had caused an opera house to be built in his villa at Pratolino. He chose the libretti, advised the composers, corresponded with Alessandro Scarlatti, but he had never a very reliable taste. He found Scarlatti's style too learned. He begged him to write some easier music, and, as far as possible, lighter. He himself did not continue the fastidiousness of the Medici, his ancestors. He somewhat stinted his outlay on music. He decided not to appoint Scarlatti his chapel master, and when this great artist asked for money at a period of embarrassment, he responded that he would pray for him. One can scarcely believe that he was less economical in his dealings with Handel, who had less reputation than Scarlatti. He seems to have paid little attention to him during his first visit. The prince himself seemed out of his element in this new world. It was necessary for him to catch up with his times. Handel certainly wrote some cantatas, only one of which, Lucretia, with a dramatic character, was very popular in Italy and in Germany later on. Its style was nearly completely German. From Florence he went to Rome for the Easter festivals in April 1707. Even there, the moment was not very favorable for him. The Grand Opera House, the Torre di Nona, had been destroyed as immoral by an edict of Pope Innocent XII 10 years before. Since 1700, things had been a little easier for the musicians, but in 1703 a terrible earthquake had desolated the country and reawakened religious qualms. Even in 1709, during the whole of Handel's sojourn in Italy, there was not a single representation of opera at Rome. On the other hand, religious music and chamber music were enjoying a great vogue. Handel, during the first months, listened and studied the religious music at Rome and tried his hand on similar works. From this period dated his Latin psalms. Thanks to the letters of recommendation he had from the Medici, he had also been introduced into the Roman salons. He became famous there, more on account of his virtuoso powers on the keyboard than of those of composer. He remained at Rome until the autumn of 1707. Doubtless he returned to Florence in the month of October, and it appears that he then produced Roderigo for the first time. Handel had then been nearly a year in Italy. He set about writing an opera in Italian. His boldness was justified. Roderigo was successful. Handel gained through it the favor of the Grand Duke and the love of the prima donna Vittoria Tarquini. Fortified by his first victory, he went on to try his luck at Venice. Venice was then the musical metropolis of Italy. It was in a way the real kingdom of opera. The first public opera house had been already open there for half a century, and after it 15 other opera houses had sprung into being. During the carnival, no less than 7 opera houses were open each evening there. Every night also a musical union was held at the Academy of Music, and occasionally twice or even 3 times in one evening. Every day in the churches, musical solemnities and concerts, which lasted for many hours, with several orchestras, many organs, and numerous full and echo choirs, and on Saturday and Sunday the famous vespers of the hospitals, those conservatoires for women where they taught music to orphans and foundlings, or, more frequently, to the girls who had fine voices. They gave orchestral and vocal concerts, over which all Venice raved. Venice, indeed, was bathed in music. The entire life was threaded with it. Life was a perpetual round of pleasure. When Handel arrived, the greatest of the Italian musicians, Alessandro Scarlatti, was about to produce at St. John Chrysostom's Theatre his chief work, Mitridate Eupatora, one of the rare Italian operas of which the dramatic beauty is on a par with the musical value. Was Alessandro Scarlatti still in Venice when Handel met him? We do not know. But in any case, he encountered him at Rome some months later, and it appears that at that time Handel was tied by bonds of friendship to the son of Alessandro, Domenico. He also made many other encounters in Venice, which were destined to change his life. The Prince of Hanover, Ernest Augustus, and the Duke of Manchester, the English ambassador extraordinary at Venice, were both passionate music lovers and interested themselves in Handel. The first invitations which Handel received to go to Hanover and to London dated doubtless from that time. But if the visit to Venice was not fruitless to the future of Handel, it brought him very little at the time. Handel could produce nothing at any of the 7 opera houses. He was much happier at Rome, where he returned at the beginning of March, 1708. The renown of his Roderigo had preceded him. All the Italian merchants strove to receive him with honor. He was the guest of the Marquis Rispoli, whose gardens on the Esquilino formed the bond of reunion for the Academy of the Arcadians. Handel found himself agreeably placed amongst the most illustrious men which Italy boasted in literature, the arts, and in the aristocracy. Arcadia, which united the nobility and the artists in a spiritual brotherhood, counted amongst its members Alessandro Scarlatti, Arcangelo Corelli, Bernardo Pasquini, and Benedetto Marcello. A similar elite society was found at the soirees of the Cardinal Ottoboni. Every Monday in the palace of Ottoboni, as at the meetings of the Arcadia, concerts and poetical recitations were given. The Cardinal Prince, superintendent of the Pontifical Chapel, had in his service the finest orchestra in Italy and the singers of the Sistine Chapel. At the Arcadia there was also to be heard a numerous orchestra under the direction of Corelli, of Pasquini, or of Scarlatti. Musical and poetical improvisation was also given there. It was that which provoked the artistic jousts between poets and musicians. It was for the concerts at the palace of Ottoboni that Handel wrote his 2 Roman oratorios, The Resurrection and The Triumph of Time and Truth, which were really but disguised operas. One finds traces of the Arcadia coterie in the compositions which are perhaps the most characteristic of this period in the life of Handel, the Italian cantatas, of which the reputation spread itself very wide, for J.S. Bach made a copy of one of them before 1715. Handel passed 3 or 4 months at Rome. He was friendly with Corelli and with the 2 Scarlattis, especially with the son Domenico, who made many trials of virtuosity with him. Perhaps he also played with Bernardo Pasquini, whom he doubtless heard more than once on his organ at Great St. Mary's. He was interested in the life of the Vatican, and they tried to convert him to Catholicism, but he refused. Such was the friendly tolerance which prevailed then at the court of Rome, that notwithstanding the war between the Pope and Emperor, this refusal did not alter the friendly relationships between the young German Lutheran and the cardinals, his patrons. He became so attached to Rome that it was difficult for him to leave it until the war, which approached the city, obliged him to take his way in the month of May or June 1708 to Naples. One of the Italian cantatas, entitled Partenza, shows his grief at leaving the lovely banks, the dear walls, and the beautiful waters of the Tiber. Soon after his arrival at Naples, Alessandro Scarlatti returned to settle there after 7 years of absence. Thanks to this friendship and his membership of the Arcadia, Handel was received into the best circles of Neapolitan society. He remained at Naples for nearly a year, from June 1708 to the spring of 1709, enjoying princely hospitality, which placed at his disposal says Mainwaring, a palace, a well-supplied table, and a coach. If the softness of the Italian life enervated him, he appears to have wasted no time. Not only did he assimilate the style of his friend Corelli, he conceived in Italy a passionate love of pictures, but he attempted, with a carefully cultivated dilettantism, the most diverse styles, with which the cosmopolitan society of Naples amused its careless curiosity. Spanish and French influence fought for the honors of this city. Handel, as indifferent as Scarlatti to the victory of either of these parties, tried to write in the style of both. He interested himself also in the Italian popular songs, and noted down the rustic melodies of the Calabrian pifferari. For the Arcadians of Naples he wrote his beautiful serenata, Axis and Galatea. Finally, he had the good fortune to please the Viceroy of Naples, the Cardinal Grimani. He was a Venetian, and his family owned the theater of San Grisostomo at Venice. Grimani wrote for Handel the libretto of the opera Agrippina, of which Handel probably composed part of the music at Naples. A similar collaboration assured it of being produced at Venice without trouble. He left Naples in the springtime and returned to Rome, where he met, at the palace of the Cardinal Ottoboni, Bishop Agostino Stefani, who by a curious combination of attributes was at the same time Kapellmeister at the court of Hanover, and charged with secret missions by different German princes. Stefani was one of the most finished musicians of his time. He established a firm friendship with Handel, possibly when traveling together to Venice, where Handel's Agrippina was playing at the opening of the carnival season, 1709-10, at the theater of San Giovanni Grisostomo. The success exceeded all anticipations. Mainwaring says that he took all his hearers by storm. There were great acclamations and cries of "Viva il caro Sassone!" and extravagances impossible to record. The grandeur of the style struck them all like thunder. The Italians had good reason to rejoice, for they found in Handel a most brilliant exponent, and Agrippina is the most melodious of his Italian operas. Venice then made and unmade reputations. The enthusiasm aroused by the representations at San Giovanni Grisostomo's spread itself out over the whole of musical Europe. Handel remained the whole of the winter at Venice. He seemed undecided as to what course to follow. It was quite on the cards that he should pass through Paris. Handel had familiarized himself with the French language. He showed, as it happened, a singular attraction for the most beautiful subjects of our French tragedy. With his prodigious adaptability and his Latin qualities, the clarity of his lines, his eloquence, logic, and his passionate love for form, he would have rejoiced exceedingly in assimilating the tradition of our art and taking it up with an irresistible vigor. But at Venice, whilst he was still hesitating what to do, he encountered the Hanoverian nobles, amongst whom was the Baron Kielmansegg, who invited him to follow them. Stefani himself had offered him with a charming grace his post as Kapellmeister at the court of Hanover. Handel went then to Hanover. End of section 3. Section 4 of Handel by Romain Rolland, translated by Arthur Eaglefield Hull. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. George Frederick Handel, His Life, Part 3. There were 4 brothers who became in turn Dukes of Hanover: Christian Louis, George William, John Frederick, and Ernest Augustus. All 4 were under the spell of France and Italy. They passed the greater part of their time away from their own states, choosing Venice for preference. George William married Morgan Atticali, a French lady of the noble family of Poitou, Eleonora d'Olbreuse. John Frederick was pensioned by Louis XIV and became Catholic. He took Versailles for his model and founded an opera in 1672 at Hanover. He had also the acumen to call Leibniz into his states, but he took great care on his side that he should remain there. He died in the course of a journey to Venice. Ernest Augustus, who succeeded him in 1680, was the patron of Steffani. He married the beautiful and intelligent Duchess Sophia, a Palatine princess, stepdaughter of James I Stuart and of the Palatine of France, and sister of the Princess Elizabeth, friend of Descartes. She herself was the friend and correspondent of Leibniz, who admired her. She had great intellectual gifts, spoke 7 languages, read widely, and had a natural taste for the beautiful. No one had greater gifts, said Madame, her niece, Michel de Montaigne. With great lucidity of thought, decidedly outspoken, she professed an Epicurean materialism of great superiority and intelligence. Her husband valued her little, but he was brilliant and ostentatious. They were the most polished and distinguished couple in Germany at the court of Hanover. Both loved music, but Ernest Augustus seems never to have dreamt that it existed anywhere outside of Italy, and he might almost as well have been called the Duke of Venice as the Duke of Hanover, for he was constantly in Venice and never wished to leave it for long. The Hanover people began to murmur. The only means they could find of keeping their prince at home with them was to build a magnificent opera house where spectacles and fetes resembling those in Venice could be given. The idea was good. Ernest Augustus warmly took up the scheme for his opera house, which, built and decorated by the Italians between 1687 and 1690, was the most beautiful in all Germany. For this opera house, Steffani was engaged as Kapellmeister. Agostino Steffani is one of the most curious figures in history. Born in 1653 at Castelfranco, near Venice, of a poor family, after being a choir boy at St. Mark's, he was taken in 1667 to Munich by the Count of Tottenbach, who had been the pupil of Ercole Bernabe, a master brought up in the purest Roman style. At the same time, he had been given a very complete education in literature, science, and theology, for he was destined for the priesthood, and with a view to becoming abbé, he was appointed organist at the court and music director. Since 1681, a set of his operas, played at Munich, and especially Servio Tullio in 1685, spread his renown through Germany. The Duke of Hanover enticed him to his court, and in 1689 the new Hanoverian Theatre was inaugurated by one of Steffani's operas, for which the Duchess Sophia furnished, it is said, the patriotic subject Enrico Leoni. Then followed a set of 15 operas, of which the mise en scène and music had an amazing popularity in Germany. Kusser introduced them at Hamburg as models of true Italian song, and Kaiser modeled himself partly on them. 10 years before Handel, in his turn, followed Kaiser's pattern. The opera did not enjoy a long life at Hanover. The Duke alone liked it. The Duchess Sophia had much less sympathy for this kind of art. The ballets and the masquerades put the opera to shame. Steffani was otherwise occupied with more serious business elsewhere. In the Treaty of Augsburg, Ernest Augustus of Hanover had taken sides with the emperor. To recompense his fidelity, the emperor bestowed on him the dignity of prince-elect, but in the confusion of the empire, it was not easy to clear up the situation. It was necessary to send an ambassador extraordinary to the great German courts. The choice of all fell on Steffani, who, being a Catholic abbé, could more easily serve as intermediary between the Protestant court of Hanover and the Catholic courts. His mission was so well accomplished that in 1697 the Duke of Hanover obtained for him the title of Elector. This astonishing diplomat had found the means of writing operas. After the death of Ernest Augustus in 1698, he gave up opera writing, but continued to occupy himself with politics. He became in 1703 the secret advisor to the Elector Palatine, the president of the religious council, who was created a noble. At the same time, Pope Innocent II made him in 1706 Bishop of Spiga. The Elector Palatine created him his grand almoner and gave him charge of the Italian and Latin correspondence with the Duke of Brunswick from November 1708 to April 1709. Steffani stayed at Rome, where the Pope crowded honors on him, making him prelate of the chamber, assistant to the throne, abbé of San Stefano in Carrara, an apostolic vicar of the north of Germany, with the supervision of the Catholics in Palatine, Brunswick, and Brandenburg. Then it was, as we have seen, that he met Handel. It is necessary to sketch briefly the life of this extraordinary personage, who was at the same time abbé, bishop, apostolic vicar, intimate counselor, and ambassador of princes, organist, kapellmeister, musical critic, chief singer, and yet composer, not only for the interest of his personality, but because he exercised considerable influence on Handel, who always retained a pleasant remembrance of him. The feature in Steffani's art, and that by which he is superior to all of his own time, is his mastery of the art of singing. Well accustomed as all the Italians were to it, none wrote so purely for the voice as he. Scarlatti was not concerned with carrying the voice to its full limits, either for an expressive purpose or with a concerted intention. Thus in Steffani, as Hugo Goldschmidt says, the singer held the pen. His work is the most perfect picture of Italian song in a golden age, and Handel owes to it his very refined feeling for the bel canto. In truth, Steffani's operas gained little by this virtuosity. They were mediocre from the dramatic point of view, not very expressive, abused the vocalization, and were essentially operas for singers. They revealed a curious harmonic vein and a contrapuntal alertness, which strongly contrasted with the nearly homophonic writing of Lully. But the principal glory of Steffani was in his chamber vocal music, and especially in his duets. These duets are of various types and of various lengths. One is a single piece. Others are in the da capo form. Some are veritable cantatas with recitatives, soli, and duets. Others are consecutive pieces, forming, as it were, little song cycles. The writing in this form was evolved from Schütz and Bernabé to Handel and Telemann, but their inner construction is usually the same. The first voice announces alone the first phrase, which reflects the poetic emotion of the piece. The second voice repeats the subject in the unison or in the octave. With the second subject, the voices leave the unison and indulge in canonic imitations which are freely treated. Then a return is made to the first part, which concludes the piece. When the duet is more developed, after the first air in the minor key, a second one comes in the major, where virtuosity is given free play, after which the minor air recurs. These works possess an admirable melodic beauty, and an expression often quite profound. In the lighter subjects, Steffani has an easy gracefulness, the elegant fancy of Scarlatti. In his sad moments, he reaches the highest models, from Schütz, from Provençal, even to J.S. Bach. He is one of the greatest lyricists in the music of the 17th century. These duets set the style in this form of work. The role played by Steffani in music can very well be compared with that of Fra Bartolomeo in painting. Both applied themselves with perfect art and steadfast spirit to find the laws of composition in limited and restrained forms. Fra Bartolomeo sought for the balance of groups and the harmony of lines and scenes. With 3 or 4 persons grouped in a round picture, Steffani concentrated all the efforts of his ingenuity, invention, and artistic science into the somewhat limited form of the duet. These two religious artists both have a luminous art, both are sure of themselves, have learning and simplicity, with little or no passion. Their souls are noble, pure, a little impersonal. They were intended to prepare the way for others. As Christender says, Handel walked in the steps of Steffani, but his feet were larger. Handel made only a short stay at Hanover in 1710. Hardly had he taken up his duties when he asked and obtained leave to go to England, from whence proposals had been made to him. He crossed Holland and arrived at London at the end of the autumn 1710. He was then 25 years old. The English musical era was broken off. 15 years before, England had lost its greatest musician, Henry Purcell, who died prematurely at the age of 36. In his short life, he had produced a considerable amount of work, operas, cantatas, religious music, and instrumental pieces. He was a cultured genius and intimately acquainted with Lully, Carlesimi, and the Italian sonatas. At the same time, very English, possessing the gift of spontaneous melody, and never losing contact with the spirit of the British race. His art was full of grace and delicacy, much more aristocratic than that of Lully. He is the Van Dyck of music. Everything of his is of extreme elegance, refinement, ease, slightly exsangue. His art is natural, always steeped in the country life, which is indeed the source of the English inspiration. There are no operas of the 17th century where one finds fresher melodies, which are more inspired and yet of a popular character. This charming artist was delicate, of a weak constitution, somewhat feminine in character, feeble, and of little stamina. His poetic languor was his strongest appeal, and at the same time his weak point. He was prevented from following his artistic progress with the tenacity of a Handel. Most of his works lack finish. He never tried to break down the final barriers which separated him from perfection. His musical compositions are sketches of genius with strange weaknesses. He produced many hastily finished operas with singular awkwardnesses in the manner of treating the instruments and the voice. Ill-fitting cadences, monotonous rhythms, a spoilt harmonic tissue, and finally, in his larger pieces and those of grander scale, there is a lack of breath, a sort of physical exhaustion, which prevents him reaching the end of his superb ideas. But it is necessary to take him for what he is, one of the most poetic figures in music, smiling, yet a little elegiac, a miniature Mozart, eternally convalescent. Nothing vulgar, nothing brutal, ever enters his music. Captivating melodies, coming straight from the heart, where the purest of English souls mirrors itself. Full of delicate harmonies, of caressing dissonances, a taste for the clashing of sevenths and seconds, of incessant poising between the major and minor, and with delicate and varied nuances of a pale tint, vague and slightly blurred, like the springtime sun piercing through a light mist. He only wrote one real opera, the admirable Dido and Aeneas of 1680. His other dramatic works, very numerous, were music for the stage, and the most beautiful type of this kind is that which he wrote for Dryden's King Arthur in 1691. This music is nearly all episodical. One cannot remove it without causing the essential action to suffer. The English taste was impatient of operas sung from one end to the other, and in Handel's time Addison endeavored to voice this national repugnance in his Spectator. It was a good thing that Handel had an altogether different idea of opera, and that his personality differed greatly from that of Purcell, which left him no point for profiting, as he had done with others, by the genius of his predecessor. Arriving in a strange country, of which he did not even know the language or the spirit, it was natural that he should take the English master as his guide. Hence the analogies between them. Purcell's odes often give one the impression of being merely a sketch of the cantatas and oratorios of Handel. One finds there the same architectural style, the same contrast of movements, of instrumental colors, of large ensembles, and of soli. Certain dances, some of the heroic airs, with irresistible rhythms and triumphant fanfares, are there already before Handel, but they are only there as brilliant flashes with Purcell. Both his personality and his art were different. Like so many fine musicians of that time, he has been swallowed up in Handel, just as a stream of water loses itself in a river. But there was nevertheless in this little spring a poetry peculiar to England, which the entire work of Handel has not, nor can have. Since the death of Purcell, the fount of English music had dried up. Foreign elements submerged it. A renewal of puritanical opposition, which attacked the English stage, contributed to the discouragement and abdication of the national artists. The last master of the great epoch, John Blow, an estimable artist, famous in his time, whose personality is a little gray and faded, was not wanting in distinction or in expressive feeling, but he had then withdrawn himself into his religious thoughts. In the absence of English composers, the Italians took possession of the field. An old musician of the Chapel Royal, Thomas Clayton, brought from Italy some opera libretti, scores, and singers. He took an old libretto from Bologna, caused it to be translated into English by a Frenchman, and clumsily adapted it to music of little worth. And such as it was, he proudly called it the first musical drama which has been entirely composed and produced in England in the Italian style. Arsinoe, Queen of Cyprus. This nullity, played at Drury Lane in 1705, had a great success, which even exceeded the authentic Italian opera given in the following year in London, Camilla, Regina del Voci, by Marc Antonio Bononcini. Vainly, Addison tried to battle against the Italian invasion by writing skits on the snobism of the public with pleasant irony. He endeavored to oppose the Italian opera with a national English one. He was defeated, and with him the entire English theatre collapsed. Tomyris in 1707 inaugurated their representations half in Italian and half in English, and after the Almahade in January 1710, all was in Italian. No English musician attempted to continue the struggle. When Handel arrived, then, at the end of 1710, national art was dead. It would be absurd to say, as some have often done, that he killed English music. There was nothing left to kill. London had not a single composer. On the other hand, she was rich in excellent players. Above all, she possessed one of the best troupes of Italian singers which could be found in Europe. Having been presented to the Queen Anne, who loved music and played the clavier well, Handel was received with open arms by the director of the opera, Aaron Hill. He was an extraordinary person who traveled in the East, wrote a history of the Ottoman Empire, composed tragedies, translated Voltaire, founded the Beech Oil Company for extracting the oil from the wood of the beech, mixing it with chemicals, and using it for the construction of ships. This orchestral man composed during a meeting the plan of an opera after Jerusalem delivered. It was Rinaldo, which was written, poem and music, in 14 days, and played for the first time on February 24, 1711, at the Haymarket. Its success was immense. It decided the victory of the Italian opera in London, and when the singer Niccolini, who took the role of Renaud, left England, he carried the score to Naples, where he had it produced in 1718 with the aid of young Leonardo Leo. The Rinaldo marked a turning point in musical history. The Italian opera, which had conquered Europe, began to be conquered in its turn by foreign musicians who had been formed by it, the Italianized Germans. After Handel, it was Hasse, then Gluck, and finally Mozart. But Handel is the first of the conquerors. After Rinaldo, and until the time when Handel had settled definitely in London, that is to say, between 1711 and the end of 1716, was an indecisive period which oscillated between Germany and England, and between religious music and the opera. Handel, who bore the title of Kapellmeister at Hanover, returned to his post in June 1711. At Hanover, he found the Bishop Steffani again, and attempted to write in his style. In this imitation, he composed some 20 chamber duets, which did not come up to their model, and some beautiful German songs on the poems by Preface. Several of his best instrumental pages, his first oboe concertos, his sonatas for flute and bass, seem to date from this time. The cavaliers of the court of Hanover were ardent flautists, and the orchestra, under the direction of Farinel, was excellent. Especially had the oboes reached a high degree of virtuosity, which has hardly been approached at the present day. On the other hand, the opera at Hanover was closed, and Handel could not even give Rinaldo. He had a taste of the theatre, and did not like abandoning his plan, so he turned his eyes again towards London. Having tested the soil of England and judged it favorable, Handel decided to establish himself there. He received regular news from England whilst in Hanover. Since his departure, no opera could hold its own except Rinaldo. The English amateurs recalled him, and Handel, burning to depart, asked for a new leave from the court of Hanover. This was granted on the easiest of terms, on condition that he returned after a reasonable time. He returned to London towards the end of November 1712, in time to supervise the representation of a pastoral Il Pastor Fido, a hasty work from which he abstracted the best airs later on. 20 days later, he had finished writing Teseo, a tragic opera in 5 very short acts, full of haste and of genius, which was given in January 1713. Handel endeavored to settle himself firmly in England. He associated himself with the loyalty and pride of the nation by writing for political celebrations. The conclusion of the Peace of Utrecht, a glorious day for England, approached. Handel prepared a Te Deum, which was already finished in January 1713, but the laws of England forbade a foreigner to be charged with composing music for official ceremonies. Parliament alone could authorize the representation of this production. Handel cleverly wrote the flattering ode for the anniversary of the birth of Queen Anne, Birthday Ode of Queen Anne. The ode was performed at St. James's on February 6, 1713, and the Queen, enchanted with the work, commanded Handel to write the Te Deum and the Jubilate for the Peace of Utrecht, which was played on July 7, 1713, at a solemn service at St. Paul's, on which occasion the members of Parliament attended. These works, in which Handel was helped by the example of Purcell, were his first great efforts in the monumental style. Handel has succeeded in securing, despite precedent, the post of official composer to the English court, but he had not acted without grave neglect of his duties towards other masters, the princes of Hanover, in whose services he still was. The relationship was extremely strained between the cousin by heritage and her poor parents at Hanover. Queen Anne had taken a dislike to them, especially as she could not endure the intelligent Duchess Sophia. She made up songs about her, and dealt secretly with the pretender Stuart, for whom she wished to secure the heritage. In remaining in her service, then, Handel took sides against his sovereign at Hanover. Certain historians have even breathed the word treason. It is the only fault which his biographer Christender does not excuse, for it wounded his German patriotism. But it is very necessary to say here that of German patriotism Handel had hardly any. He had the mentality of the great German artists of his time, for whom the country was art and religion. The state mattered little to him. He lived then amongst the English patrons for a year with a wealthy music lover in Surrey, then in Piccadilly at Lord Burlington's palace. He remained there 3 years. Pope and Swift were familiars in the house, which Gay had described. Handel performed there on the organ and clavecin before the elite of London society, by whom he was much admired, with the exception of Pope, who did not like music. He composed a little, being satisfied to exist, as in his sojourn at Naples, waiting without hurry to be saturated by the English atmosphere. Handel was one of those who can write 3 operas in 2 months and then do nothing more for a year. It is the rule of the torrential river, which sometimes overflows and then runs dry. He waited the course of events. The inheritors of Hanover seemed decidedly ousted. The Duchess Sophia died on June 7, 1714. Christender says of grief, but it was certainly also apoplexy, convinced that the Stuart would attain the coveted heritage. Less than ever did Handel breathe a word of returning to Hanover, but chance upset all his plans. 2 months after the death of the Duchess Sophia, Queen Anne died suddenly on August 1, 1714. The same day, in the confusion into which events had thrown the Stuart party, George of Hanover was proclaimed king by the secret council. On September 20, he arrived in London. He was crowned at Westminster on October 20, and Handel, very perturbed at the thought of his ode to Queen Anne, had the mortification of seeing that had he waited another year, his Te Deum would have served for the enthronement of the new dynasty. To do him full justice, he did not seem much discomfited by this turn of fortune's wheel. He did not put himself about to ask for pardon. He set to work instead and wrote Amadigi. It was the very best way for him to plead his cause. George I of Hanover had many faults, but he had one good quality. He loved music sincerely, and this passion was shared by very many of the people, more or less notable in his court. Music had always been for Germany the fountain where soiled hearts purified themselves, the redemption from the petty baseness of the daily round, the common task. Whatever King George thought of Handel, he could not punish him without punishing himself. After the success of his charming Amadigi, played for the first time on May 25, 1715, he had not the courage to harbor malice any longer against his musician. They were reconciled. Handel resumed his post of Kapellmeister at Hanover by now acting as the music master to the little princesses, and when the king went to Hanover in July 1716, Handel traveled with him. It was not that he had much occupation at the court. The king was too engrossed in state business and with hunting. He did not even find time to be anxious about his old retainer, Leibnitz, who died at Hanover on November 14, 1716, unnoticed at court. Handel took advantage of this leisure to renew his acquaintance with the German art. There was then in Germany a fashion for musical passions. There was a religious and theatrical tendency at that time. One cannot separate the influence of pietism and that of the opera. Kaiser, Telemann, Mattheson all wrote passions, which caused a great stir at Hamburg on the famous text of the Senator Brockus. Following their example, perhaps in order to measure himself with these men, who had all three been rivals or friends, Handel took the same text and wrote on it in 1716 his Passion after Brockus. This powerful and disparate work, where bad taste mingles with the sublime, where affectation and pomposity are mingled with the most profound and serious art, a work which J.S. Bach knew well and very carefully remembered, was for Handel a decided experience. He felt in writing it what a great gulf separated him from the pietist German art, and on his return to England he composed the Psalms and Esther. This was the principal epoch of his life. Between 1717 and 1720, whilst he was in the service of the Duke of Chandos, he made a careful examination of his own personality and created a new style in music and for the theater. The Chandos anthems, or psalms, stand, in relation to Handel's oratorios, in the same position as his Italian cantatas stand to his operas. They are splendid sketches of the more monumental works. In these religious cantatas, written for the Duke's chapel, Handel gives the first place to the choruses. It is the exact words of the Bible which they sing, strong, heroic words, freed from all the commentary and sentimental effusions with which German pietism had loaded them. There is already in them the spirit and the style of Israel and Egypt, the great monumental lines, the popular feeling. It was only a step from this to the colossal biblical dramas. Handel took the step with Esther, which in its first form was entitled Haman and Mordecai, a Masque. Quite possibly the work had its first presentation at the Duke of Chandos's, but on August 29, 1720, it was presented on the stage. It was, in any case, one of the greatest tragedies in the old style, which had been written since the Grecian period. It was as though the spirit of Handel had been led insensibly towards the Hellenic ideal, for he composed nearly at the same time his pastoral tragedy Axis and Galatea, to which he also gave the name of Masque, and which did not disengage itself from the complete idea of a free theater. This little masterpiece of poetry and of music, where the beautiful Sicilian legend unfolds itself in pictures, smiling and mournful, has a classical perfection which Handel never surpassed. End of section 4. Section 5 of Handel by Romain Rolland, translated by Arthur Eaglefield Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. George Frederick Handel, His Life, Part 4. Esther and Axis bore witness to Handel's desire to bring to the surface of dramatic action all the powers of choral and symphonic music. Even in these two works, which unquestionably opened up the way for his future oratorios, it is not the oratorio which is his aim, but the opera. Always attracted by the theater, only a succession of disasters, of accumulating ruin, thrust him away later against his will. So it is natural to find him at the same time, when he was writing Esther and Axis, also undertaking the musical direction of a theater enterprise, which led later on to one of the most important steps of his life, the Academy of Italian Opera. Handel saw, it is said, in the year 1720, the end of his years of apprenticeship. He certainly terminated, although he knew it not, his years of tranquility. Up to then he had led the life of numberless other great musicians who lived under the protection of princes and wrote for a select audience. He had only occasion to leave this path with his religious and national works, where he had voiced a people's feelings. After 1720, and indeed up to the time of his death, all the rest of his art belonged to everybody. He put himself at the head of a theater and opened a struggle with the public at large. He exerted prodigious vitality, writing 2 or 3 operas every year, knocking into shape an undisciplined troupe of virtuosi smothered with pride, harassed with intrigues, hindered by bankruptcy, using his genius for 20 years in the paradoxical task of thrusting on London a shaky and shallow Italian opera, which could not live under a sun and in a climate unsuitable to it. At the end of this strife, enraged, conquered, but invincible, sowing on his way all his masterpieces, he reached the pinnacle of his art, those grand oratorios which rendered him immortal. After a voyage in Germany, to Hanover, to Halle, to Dusseldorf, and to Dresden, to recruit for his troupe of Italian singers, Handel inaugurated at the Haymarket Theatre the London Opera of April 27, 1720, with his Radamistu, which was dedicated to the king. The rush of the public was very great indeed, but it was due more to curiosity than to the turn of the fashion. Soon the snobbishness of the amateurs could no longer content itself with Italianized German as the representative of Italian opera, and finally Lord Burlington, Handel's former patron, went to Rome to induce the king of the Italian style, Giovanni Bononcini, to come over. Bononcini came from Modena. He was about 50 years old, son of an artist of great merit, Giovanni Bononcini, whose premature death cut short a career rich with promise, brought up with an almost paternal affection by one of the first masters of that epoch, one of the few who had preserved the cult and the science of the past, Giampaolo Colonna, organist of St. Pietronio at Bologna. He had benefited early in life by a high princely, even imperial, protection. More precocious even than Handel, he published his first works at the age of 13, was member of the Philharmonic Academy of Bologna at 14, and master of the chapel at 15. His first works were instrumental. This was his specialty, having inherited his gift from his father. He only reached the opera after having tried all the other styles. It was not with him a natural calling. He was a born concert musician, and he remained so even in the opera. His tours in Germany and in Austria, where he was created imperial composer in 1700 and gave his Polifemo at Berlin in 1703, fully established his renown in Europe. His music spread in France after 1706 and excited there an almost incredible infatuation. When in Italy, his reputation surpassed even that of Scarlatti, who himself, according to Mr. Dent, came under his influence to a small extent. He had a European vogue for about 10 or 15 years. He was, so to speak, the reflection of the society of his time. What strikes one in his music, if we are to believe Le Cerf de la Vieille Ville, is the boldness of his modulations, the abundance of his vocal ornaments, the unruliness of his mind. His style seemed to Lullius that of the affected and distorted order, as opposed to the school of common sense. Bononcini was a verticalist, then, differing from the horizontalists of the preceding epoch. He was essentially a sensuous musician and an anti-intellectualist. Right from the beginning, as an instrumental composer, he always remained indifferent to his poems, to his subjects, and to everything which was outside of the music. In his music he set a pleasing sonority above everything, and it was evidently on this account that his work required less effort of the intelligence than was necessitated by the severe art of Scarlatti, or the recitative and expressive art of Lully. In him was inaugurated the reaction of fashionable good taste in the general public against that of the savant. Contrast the grand airs da capo, broadly developed in a more or less contrapuntal fashion, with his tiny little airs, also da capo, but in miniature, easy to understand, which touched the popular feeling for melody. He carefully perfumed it and served it up for the taste of the elegant and fashionable. This distinguished simplicity, this delicate sensibility, rather feeble, always so correct in its audacities and restrained in its pleasures, made Bononcini a drawing-room favorite, a fashionable revolutionary. The more he worked, the more his traits were accentuated and became permanent. As happens to all artists who enjoy too much success, this reacted on his art and imposed on him the repetition of certain fixed patterns. The natural laziness of Bononcini only exaggerated this tendency, so that from year to year this affectedness appeared in his art, making it quite mechanical. His music, often beautiful and gracious, always harmonious, never expressive, unrolled itself as a succession of elegant and highly finished subjects, all cut out as if with scissors on the same pattern, and indefinitely repeated. At first in London, one was only conscious of his charm. The personality of the musician added to the attractions of his music. The gentle Italian had polished manners, a quality at once lovable and penetrated by a bold courage. He was a virtuoso like Handel, but on an instrument more distinguished than the clavier, on the violoncello, and he was listened to with respect in the aristocratic salons. He was, so to speak, the author à la mode, and his Astarto, given at the end of 1720, erased the impression made by Handel's Radomisto. Handel had his work cut out. He was not suited to strive with Bononcini on the ground of Italianism. However, he was up against the wall. The English public, always keen on bear fights, cockfights, and virtuoso contests, amused themselves by arranging a joust between Bononcini and Handel. They were to be tested by an opera written in combination. Handel took up the glove and was beaten. His Muzio Savola, March 1721, is very feeble, and the Floridante, which followed, December 9th, 1721, is little better. The success of the Italian increased his fame, and the pretty Griselda, February 1722, consummated Bononcini's glory. He benefited by the strenuous opposition of the English littérateurs and the leading aristocrats against the Hanoverian court and the German artists. Handel's situation was much involved, but he took his revenge with the melodious opera Ottone, January 12, 1723, which was the most popular of all his operas. Victorious then, he went straight ahead without troubling himself about Bononcini, and he composed, one after another, 3 masterpieces in which he inaugurated a new musical theater, as musically rich and more dramatic than that of Rameau, some 10 years later. Giulio Cesare, February 20th, 1724, Tamerlano, October 21st, 1724, and Rodalinda, February 13th, 1725. The last of Tamerlano is a magnificent example of the great music drama, an example nearly unique before Gluck in its poignancy and passion. Bononcini's party was definitely ruined, but the greatest difficulties now began for Handel. The London opera was delivered over into the hands of castrati and prima donna and the extravagances of their supporters. In 1726, there arrived the most celebrated Italian singer of the time, the famous Faustina. From this moment, the London representations became mere jousts of song between Faustina and Cuzzoni, jousts as strenuous as the shouting of their various partisans. Handel wrote his Alessandro, May 5th, 1721, for an artistic duel between the two stars of his troupe, who acted as the two mistresses of Alessandro. In spite of all, his dramatic genius won the day by several sublime scenes from Almato, January 31st, 1727, the grandeur of which veritably seized hold of the public. But the rivalry of the singers, far from being appeased, redoubled in fury. Each party had its hired pamphleteers, who let loose on the adversary the most degrading libels. Cuzzoni and Faustina reached such a state of rage that on June 6, 1727, during the play, they fought and tore each other's hair unmercifully, amidst the yells of the audience, the Princess of Wales being present. After this, everything went to the dogs. Handel tried hard to take the reins, but, as his friend Arbuthnot said, the devil was loose and could never be caged again. The battle was lost. Despite 3 new works of Handel, where his genius again shone forth, Riccardo I, November 11, 1727, Seroe, February 17, 1728, and Tolomeo, April 30, 1728. A little venture by John Gay and by Pepusch, The Beggar's Opera, a war opera, finished the defeat of the London Academy of Opera. This excellent operetta, spoken in dialogue, with popular songs interspersed, was at the same time a trenchant satire on Walpole and a spirited parody of the ridiculous sides of the opera. Its immense success took the character of a national manifestation. It was a reaction of popular common sense against the pompous childishness of the Italian opera, and against the snobbishness which attempted to impose it on other nations. We see in this the first blow struck at the triumphant Italianism. Nationality awoke. In 1729, the Passion according to St. Matthew was given. Some years later, Handel's earlier oratorios were performed, and also the first operas of Rameau. In 1728 to 1729, Martin Heinrich Fuhrmann entered the campaign against Italian opera with his famous pamphlets. After him, Matheson re-entered the ring, the Goths and their hippogriffs to be purified in the crater of Etna. But nowhere was this national reaction so widely spread as in England, where it roused itself with such robust humor as with Swift and with Pope, those famous layers of ghosts and dreams. Handel felt this. After 1727, he sought steadily to establish himself on the national English soil. He had become a naturalized Englishman on February 13, 1726. He wrote for the coronation of the new king, George II, his coronation anthems, September 11, 1727. He returned to his plans for the English oratorios, but he was not yet sufficiently sure of his ground, nor of the public taste, to justify him in completely throwing over the Italian opera, for he realized more than before the resources of the people and what he could do with them. Besides, the collapse of the London Academy of Opera had not touched his personal prestige. He was regarded not only in England, but also in France, as the greatest man of the lyric theatre. His London Italian operas became known all over Europe. Fabius, Tamerlan, Othon, Renaud, César, Admete, Siroe, Rodelinda, et Richard, éternels monuments dressés à sa mémoire. Des opéras romaines surpasseront la gloire. Venise Louis Putel opposer un rival. One can well understand, then, that Handel was tempted by the desire of taking on his own shoulders, without the control which hampered him, the complete enterprise of the Italian opera. At the end of the summer of 1728, he went to Italy in search of new arms for the strife. In the course of this tour, which lasted nearly a year, he recruited his singers, renewed his collection of libretti and Italian scores. Above all, he refreshed his Italianism at the source of the new school of opera founded by Leonardo Vinci, which reacted against the concert style in the theater and sought to give back to opera a more dramatic character, even at the risk of impoverishing the music. Without sacrificing the richness of his style, Handel did not neglect to profit by these examples in his new operas Lothario, December 1729, Partenope, February 1730, Porro, February 1731, Ezio, January 1732, which are notable, particularly the last two, by the beauty of the melodic writing and the dramatic power of certain pages. The masterpiece of this period is Orlando, January 27, 1733, of which the richness and musical perfection are on a level with the insight into the characters and the spirited and passionate life of the piece. If the Tamerlano of 1724 awakens ideas of Gluck's tragedies, it is the beautiful operas of Mozart which come to mind in Orlando. In continuation of the strife for the Italian opera, Handel profited by the unexpected success with which the English people had met the reproduction of his Axis and Galatea and his Esther, written to English words, and he attempted again, in a more conscientious fashion than 10 years before, at Chandos's, to found a form of musical theater, freer and richer, where the lyricism of the choruses had free play. For the reproduction of Esther in 1732, he introduced into the work of 1720 the most beautiful choruses from the coronation anthems. In the following year he wrote Deborah, March 17, 1733, and Athalia, July 10, 1733, where the chorus took first place. These grand biblical dramas would have been able to have awakened in the English nation an enthusiastic response, were it not that this attempt was damaged by a violent quarrel inspired by personal reasons, where art counted for nothing. A dead set was made against Deborah, and though Athalia succeeded at Oxford, Handel did not present it in London until 2 years later. Once again, Handel returned to Italian opera. The public hatred pursued him here also. The royal family of Hanover was detested. It added to its own discredit by the scandalous disputes which took place between the king and his son. The Prince of Wales, in a spirit of petty spite against his father, who showed his affection for Handel, amused himself by attempting to ruin the composer. Encouraged by the opposition, and enchanted by the idea of making sport against the king, he founded a rival opera house, and as he could no longer set Bononcini up against Handel, as the former had been discredited by a case of flagrant plagiarism, which had an European circulation, he approached Porpora with a view to directing his theatre. Then, says Lord Hervey, the struggle became as serious as that of the Greens against the Blues at Constantinople under Justinian. An anti-Handelian was regarded as an anti-royalist, and in Parliament to vote against the court was hardly more dangerous than to speak against Handel. On the other hand, the immense unpopularity of the king redounded on Handel, and the aristocracy combined to secure his downfall. He accepted the challenge, and after a third tour in Italy during the summer of 1733, again to recruit more singers, he bravely took up the fight with Porpora, to whom was added Hasse in 1734. They were the greatest rivals against which he had yet measured himself. But Hasse and Porpora had strong dramatic feeling, and especially were they the most perfect masters of the beautiful art of Italian melody and singing. Niccolo Porpora, who came from Naples, was 47 years old. He had a cold but vigorous spirit, intelligent and possessing more than anyone else, except Hasse, all the resources of the Italian singing. His style was very beautiful, and it was not less broad than that of Handel. No other Italian musician of this time had such ample breadth of phrasing. His writings seem of a later age than Handel's, and approximate to the time of Gluck and Mozart. Whilst Handel, despite his marvelous feeling for plastic beauty, often treated the voices as an instrument, and in his development the beautiful Italian lines occasionally became weighed down by German complexity, Porpora's music always kept within the bounds of classic purity, though the form was a little uninteresting in design. History has never done him sufficient justice. He was quite worthy of measuring himself against Handel, and the comparison between Handel's Ariana and that of Porpora, played at an interval of a few weeks, did not prove to the advantage of the former. Handel's music is elegant, but one does not find the breadth of certain airs in Porpora's Ariana Anaxos. The form of these airs is perhaps of too classic a correctness, but the right Grecian breezes blow across his Roman temples. He has been claimed as an Italian disciple of Gluck, a curious criticism which is bestowed occasionally on precursors. It was so with Jacopo della Quercia, who inspired Michelangelo, and to whom the latter seems to owe something. Hasse was even superior to Porpora in the charm of his melody, which Mozart alone has equaled, and in his symphonic gifts, which showed themselves in his rich instrumental accompaniments, no less melodious than his songs. Handel was not slow to discover the folly of striving with Hasse on Italian ground. His superiority was with the choruses. He sought to introduce them into the opera, after the French model. The situation was even less promising for him on the departure of his best protectress, the Princess Anne, sister of the Prince of Wales. After having compromised Handel by the strong feeling which she had shown in defending him, she left him to the tender cares of the enemies which she had made for him. She left England in April 1734 to join her husband, the Prince of Orange, in Holland. Handel came to be abandoned by his old friends. His associate Heidegger, the proprietor of the Haymarket Theatre, took the hall for a rival opera, and Handel, driven from the house in which he had worked for 14 years, had to emigrate with his troupe to John Rich's place at Covent Garden, a sort of music hall where opera took its turn with all kinds of other spectacles, ballets, pantomimes, and harlequinades. In Rich's troupe, some French dancers were to be found, amongst whom was La Salle, who was shortly to arouse great enthusiasm amongst the English public with 2 tragic dancers, Pygmalion and Bacchus and Ariadne. Handel, who had known the French art for a long time, saw how far he could draw on these new resources, and he opened the season of 1734 at Covent Garden with a first attempt in the field of the French ballet opera, Terpsichore, November 9, 1734, in which La Salle took the principal role. A month later, a pasticcio followed Orestes, where Handel gave a similar important part to La Salle and to her expressive dances. Finally, he intermingled the dance and the choruses closely with the dramatic action in 2 masterpieces of poetry and beautiful musical construction, Ariodante, January 8, 1735, and especially Alcina, April 16, 1735. Bad luck still pursued him. Some gross national manifestations compelled La Salle and her French dancers to leave London. Handel gave up the ballet opera. To leave at this moment, if he was to continue the struggle with the theatre, went badly against the grain, and was tantamount to declaring himself vanquished. At the opening of his theatrical enterprise he had saved, so it is said, £10,000. All this was absorbed, and already he was £10,000 more to the bad. His friends did not understand his obstinacy, which seemed about to involve him in complete ruin. But, says Hawkins, he was a man of intrepid spirit, and in no ways a slave to mere interest. He raised himself again for the battle, rather than bow down to those whom he regarded as infinitely beneath him. If he could no longer be conqueror, still less would he hand the reins to his adversaries. He overcame them, but a little more would have vanquished himself in the same stroke. He persisted then in writing his operas, of which the series spread out until 1741, marking work after work with a growing tendency towards the opera comique and the style of romances so dear to the people at the second half of the 18th century. But since 1735, he felt more than ever that the true musical drama for him was the oratorio. He returned victoriously with Alexander's Feast, which was composed on the Ode to St. Cecilia by Dryden and given for the first time on February 19th, 1736, at the Covent Garden Theatre. Who would have believed that this work, robust and sane throughout, was written in 20 days, that it was performed in the midst of his business worries, within an ace of ruin, and when he was threatened with that grave malady which was to throw the mind of Handel for evermore into gloom. End of section 5. Section 6 of Handel by Romain Rolland, translated by Arthur Eaglefield Hull. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. George Frederick Handel, His Life, Part 5. For several years, trouble pursued him. Work and excessive worry had undermined an iron constitution. He tried the baths at Tunbridge Wells during the summer of 1735, and probably also in 1736, but with no success. He could not sleep. His theater was always on his mind. He made superhuman efforts to keep it going. From January 1736 to April 1737, he directed 2 seasons of opera, 2 seasons of oratorio, and composed a song, an oratorio, a psalm, and 4 operas. On April 12th or 13th, 1737, the machine broke down. He was smitten with paralysis. His right side was attacked. His hand refused all service, and even his mind was affected. In his absence, his theater closed its doors, bankrupt. During the whole of the summer, Handel remained in a pitiful state of depression. He refused to care for anything. All hope was lost. Finally, his friends succeeded in inducing him, towards the end of August, to try the baths at Aix-la-Chapelle. The cure had a miraculous effect. In a few days he was restored. In October, he returned to London, and immediately the refreshed giant resumed the struggle, writing in 3 months 2 operas and the magnificent funeral anthem on the death of the Queen. Sad days were in store, however. His creditors seized him, and he was threatened with imprisonment. Happily, a sympathetic movement was inaugurated in favor of the artist, so harassed by his kind. A benefit concert, to which his pride reluctantly submitted at the end of March 1738, had an unexpected success. It freed him from the most pressing of his debts. In the following month, a token of public admiration was given him. His statue was erected in the Vauxhall Gardens. In the springtime of 1738, he began to feel, with returning strength, confidence in the future. The horizon cleared. He was encouraged by such faithful sympathy. He returned to life and made his presence felt again. On July 23rd, he commenced Saul. On August 8th, he had written 2 acts of it. By September 27th, the work was finished. On October 7th, he began Israel in Egypt. By October 28th, the work was achieved. Still pushing strenuously forward, on October 4th, he launched the first volume of his organ concertos with the publisher Walsh, and on the 7th he took to him his 7 trios or sonatas in 2 parts, with bass, opus 5. For those who know these joyful works, which dominate like 2 colossi the 2 oratorios of victory, this superhuman effort had the effect of a force of nature, like a field which breaks into flower in a single night of springtime. Saul is a great epic drama, flowing and powerful, where the humorous and the tragic intermingle. Israel is one immense chorale, the most gigantic effort which has ever been made in oratorio, not only with a single but with combined choirs. The audacious originality of the conception and its austere grandeur almost stunned the public of his day. The living Handel breathes throughout the work. The hopes which Handel had founded on England caused him fresh uneasiness. Times were hard. Since the winter of 1739, theatrical performances and even concerts were suspended for several months on account of the war. and the extreme cold. Handel, to keep himself warm, wrote in 8 days the little ode to St. Cecilia, November 29th, 1739. In 16 days, L'Allegro, Il Penseroso, ed Il Moderato of Milton, January-February 1740. In a month, the Concerti Grossi, Opus 6, but the success of these charming works, graven out with loving care, into which Handel had perhaps put more than into any other his own personal feelings, his poetic and humorous reproductions of nature, was hardly sufficient yet to establish his affairs, at one time so embarrassed. Once more, as in the time of Deborah and Ariana, he was attacked by a coalition of fashionable people. One does not know how Handel had wounded them, but they were resolved on his downfall. They avoided his concerts. They even paid men to pull down his placards in the street. Handel, tired and disheartened, suddenly threw up the combat. He decided to leave England, where he had lived for nearly 30 years, and where he had increased his fame so much. He announced his last concert for April 8th, 1741. It is a remarkable thing that often in the lives of the great men, just at the moment when all seems lost, or things are at their lowest ebb, they are nearest to the fulfillment of their destiny. Handel appeared vanquished. Just at that very hour he wrote a work which was destined to establish permanently his immortality. He left London. The Lord Lieutenant of Ireland invited him to Dublin to direct some concerts. Thus it was, so he said, in order to offer this generous and polished nation something new, that he composed the Messiah on a poem by his friend Jennens. They had already given many of his religious works in Dublin for charitable concerts. Handel was received enthusiastically. The letter, which he wrote on December 29th to Jennens, bubbles over with joy. The time which he passed in Dublin was, together with his early years in Italy, the happiest in his life. From December 23rd, 1741 to April 7th, 1742, he gave 2 series of 6 concerts, and always with the same success. Finally, on April 12th, the first hearing of the Messiah took place in Dublin. The proceeds of the concert were devoted to charitable objects, and the success was very considerable. 8 days after having finished the Messiah, that is to say, before he had yet arrived in Ireland, Handel had commenced Samson, which was finished in 5 weeks, from the end of September to the end of October 1741. However, he did not give it in Dublin. Doubtless he could not find the interpreters which he desired for this colossal drama, rich in choral scenes and in difficult roles. Perhaps also he reserved the work for the following season in Dublin, when he hoped to return. But the expected invitation which he awaited in London did not come, and it was in London that Samson reached its first hearing on February 18th, 1743. To this heroic oratorio, based on the sublime Samson Agonistes of Milton, succeeded a light opera which bore, nevertheless, the name of oratorio, the libretto of which was based on a poem by Congreve, Semele, June 3rd to July 4th, 1743. It afforded a relief for him between these 2 Herculean works. In the same month in which he finished Semele, Handel wrote his monumental Dettingen Te Deum to celebrate the victory of the Duke of Cumberland over the French. Joseph, written in August and September of the same year on a very touching poem by James Miller, reveals a sweet yet melancholy fancy, a little insipid, on which, however, the strong portrait of Simeon projects itself forcibly. 1744 was one of Handel's most glorious years from the creative point of view, but one of the most miserable in outward success. He wrote nearly simultaneously his 2 most tragic oratorios, the great Shakespearean drama of Belshazzar, July-October 1744, the rich poem of which was furnished for him by his friend Jennens, and the sublime tragedy of the ancient Hercules, a musical drama which marks the culmination of the Handelian musical drama, and indeed one might say of the whole musical theatre before Gluck. Never was the hostility of the English public more roused against him. The same hateful cabal which had already thrice threatened to bring about his downfall again rose against him. They invited the fashionable world in London to their fêtes, specially organized on the days when the performances of his oratorios were to have taken place, with the object of robbing him of his audience. Bolingbroke and Smollett both speak of the plots of certain ladies to ruin Handel. Horace Walpole says that it was the fashion to go to the Italian opera when Handel directed his oratorio concerts. Handel, whose force of energy and genius had weakened since his first failure of 1735, was involved afresh in bankruptcy at the beginning of 1745. His griefs and troubles, and the prodigious expenditure of force which he made, seemed again on the point of turning his brain. He fell into extreme bodily prostration and lowness of spirit, similar to that of 1737, and this lasted for the space of 8 months, from March to October 1745. By a miracle he was able to rise out of this abyss, and by unforeseen events, where music was his only aid, he became more popular than he ever was before. The pretender, Charles Edward, landed in Scotland. The country rose up. An army of Highlanders marched on London. The city was in consternation. A great national movement arose in England. Handel associated himself with it. On November 14th, 1745, he brought to light at Drury Lane his song made for the gentlemen volunteers of the city of London, and he wrote 2 oratorios, which were, so to speak, immense national hymns. The occasional oratorio, where Handel called the English to rise up against invasion, and Judas Maccabeus, July 9th to August 11th, 1746. The Hymn of Victory, written after the rout of the rebels at Culloden Moor, and for the fête on the return of the Conqueror, the ferocious Duke of Cumberland, to whom the poem was dedicated. These 2 patriotic oratorios, where Handel's heart beat with that of England, and of which the second, Judas Maccabeus, has retained even to our own day its great popularity, thanks to its broad style, and the spirit which animates it, brought more fortune to Handel than all the rest of his works together. After 35 years of continuous struggle, plot and counterplot, he at last obtained a decisive victory. He became the force of events, the national musician of England. Freed from material cares which had embittered his life, Handel took up the work of his composition again with more tranquillity, and in the following years came many of his happiest works. Alexander Balus, June 1st to July 4th, 1747, is, like Semele, a concert opera, well developed, the orchestration being exceptionally rich and subtle. Joshua, July 30th to August 18th, 1747, is a somewhat pale replica of Judas Maccabeus. A gentle love idyll blossoms amidst the pompous choruses. Solomon, June 1748, is a musical festival radiating poetry and gladness. Susanna, July 11th, 1724 to August 1748, grave and gay by turns, realistic yet lyric, is a hybrid kind of work, but very original. Finally, in the spring of 1749, which marks, so it seems, the end of Handel's good fortune, he wrote his brilliant firework music, a model for popular open-air fêtes, produced on April 27, 1749, by a monster orchestra of trumpets, horns, oboes, and bassoons, without stringed instruments, on the occasion of the firework display given in Green Park to celebrate the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle. More solemn works followed these gay pieces. At this moment of his life, the spirit of melancholy raised its gray head before the robust old man, who seemed to be obsessed by the presentiment of some coming ill fortune. On May 27, 1749, he conducted at the Foundling Hospital, for the benefit of waifs and strays, his beautiful anthem for the Foundling Hospital, which was inspired by his great pity for these little unfortunates. From June 28th to July 31st, he wrote a pure masterpiece, Theodora, his most intimate musical tragedy, his only Christian tragedy besides the Messiah. From the end of that same year dates also his music for a scene from Tobias Smollett's Alceste, which was never played, and from which Handel took the essential parts for his choice of Hercules. A little time after he made his last voyage to Halle, he arrived on German soil at the moment when Bach died, July 28, 1750. Indeed, he nearly ended his life there himself in the same week by a carriage accident. He recovered quickly, and on January 21, 1751, when he commenced the score of Jephthah, he appeared to be in robust health, despite his 66 years. He wrote the first act at a stretch in 13 days. In 11 days more, he had arrived at the last scene but one of Act 2. Here he had to break off. Already, in the preceding pages, he only progressed with difficulty. His writing, so clear and firm at the commencement, became sticky, confused, and trembling. He had started on the final chorus of Act 2. How dark, O Lord, are thy ways. Hardly had he written the opening largo, then he had to stop working. He wrote, I reached here on Wednesday, February 13, had to discontinue on account of the sight of my left eye. The work was broken off for 10 days. On February 23rd, which was his birthday, he wrote in, Feel a little better, resumed work. And he wrote the music to those foreboding words, Grief follows joy, as night the day. He took hardly 5 days to finish this chorus, which is really sublime. He stopped then for 4 months. On June 18th, he resumed the third act. He was again interrupted in the middle. The last 4 airs and the final chorus took more time than a whole oratorio usually occupied. He did not finish it until August 30th, 1751. His sight was then gone. After that, all was ended. Handel's eyes were closed forever. The sun was blotted out. Total eclipse. The world was effaced. He had never suffered so much as in the first year of his illness, when he was not yet completely blind. In 1752, he was unable to play the organ at the productions of his oratorios, and the public, moved by sympathy, saw him tremble and blanch in listening to the admirable complaint of his blind Samson. But in 1753, when the evil was incurable, Handel regained his self-possession. He played the organ again at the 12 performances of oratorios, which he gave each year in Lent, and he kept up this custom until his death. But with his vanished sight, he had lost the best source of his inspiration. This man who is neither an intellectual nor a mystic, one who loved above all things light and nature, beautiful pictures, and the spectacular view of things, who lived more through his eyes than most of the German musicians, was engulfed in deepest night. From 1752 to 1759, he was overtaken by the semi-consciousness which precedes death. He only wrote in 1758 a duet and chorus for Judas Maccabeus. Zion, now her head shall raise, and reviving in that the happy times of other days, he took up a work of his youth, the Trionfo del Tempo, which he now gave in a new version in March 1757, The Triumph of Time and Truth. On April 6, 1759, he again took the organ at a production of the Messiah. His powers failed him in the middle of a movement. He soon recovered himself and improvised, it is said, with his habitual grandeur. Returned home, he took to bed. On April 11th, he added a last codicil to his will, bequeathing munificently £1,000 sterling to the Society for the Maintenance of Poor Musicians, and expressing with tranquillity his desire of being buried in Westminster Abbey. He said, I want to die on Good Friday, in the hope of rejoining the good God, my sweet Lord and Savior, on the day of his resurrection. His wish was accomplished. On Holy Saturday, April 14th, at 8 in the morning, the sweet singer of the Messiah slept with his Lord. His glory spread after his death. On April 20th, he was interred in Westminster Abbey, as he had requested. The annual performances of his oratorios continued in Lent under the direction of his friend Christopher Smith. Popular performances of them were soon given. The great festival of his commemoration, celebrated at Westminster Abbey and in the Pantheon from May 26 to June 5, 1784, from the centenary of his birth, was observed all over Europe. New festivals took place in London in 1785, 1786, 1787, 1790, and 1791. On the last occasion, more than 1,000 executants took part. Haydn was present, and he said through his tears, "He is master of us all." The English performances attracted the attention of Germany. 2 years after the commemoration, Johann Adam Hiller produced the Messiah in the Cathedral Church at Berlin, then at Leipzig, and then at Breslau. 3 years later, in 1789, Mozart made his arrangements of the Messiah, of Axis and Galatea, of the Ode to St. Cecilia, and of Alexander's Feast. The first complete edition of Handel was commenced in 1786. A strong feeling of emulation made itself felt in Germany to imitate the English festivals, and to restore choral singing, and to found the Singakademien for the preservation of the national glories. The rendering of Handel's oratorios inspired Haydn to write The Creation. Beethoven, at the end of his life, said of Handel, "See, there is the truth." Poets also vied equally in rendering him homage. Goethe admired him, and Herder devoted a chapter to him in his Adrastea of 1802. The Wars of Independence gave an access of favor to the Oratorio of Freedom to Judas Maccabeus. With Romanticism, the feeling for the genius of Handel was lost. Berlioz, who, if he had but known him truly, and had found a model for that grand popular style which he sought, never understood him. Of all other musicians, those who approached to the spirit of Handel nearest were Schumann and Liszt, but they were exceptional in the lucidity of their perception and their generous sympathies. It might be said that Handel's art, distorted by the additions and false renderings, quite as much those in Germany as the ridiculously colossal representations in England, would have been completely lost, except for the foundation in 1856 of the Handel Society, which devoted itself to the object of publishing an exact and complete edition of the works of the master. Gervinus was the promoter, and Friedrich Chrysander alone accomplished the task. It did not aim at being a critical edition of his works. His ardent apostle sought simply to revive them in their pristine force. He was seconded by the choral societies of North Germany, particularly by the Berlin Singakademien, which from 1830 to 1860 never ceased to perform all the oratorios of Handel. On the contrary, Austria remained a long way behind. In 1873, Brahms conducted the first production of Saul in Vienna, but the veritable awakening of Handel's art in Germany only dates back about half a score years. One recognized his grandeur and did not doubt that he had lived. It was chiefly, so it seems, at the first Handel Festival in Mayence in 1895, where Hercules and Deborah were given, that his astounding dramatic genius was first truly felt there. To us in France, we still await the full revelation of the living scenes of this great and luminous tragic art, so akin to the aims of ancient Greece. End of section 6. Section 7 of Handel by Romain Rolland, translated by Arthur Eaglefield Hull. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. His Technique and Works. Part 1. His Technique and Works. No great musician is more impossible to include in the limits of one definition, or even of several, than Handel. It is a fact that he reached the complete mastery of his style very early, much earlier than J.S. Bach, although it was never really fixed, and he never devoted himself to any one form of art. It is even difficult to see a conscious and a logical evolution in him. His genius is not of the kind which follows a single path and forges right ahead until it reaches its object. For his aim is none other than to do well whatever he undertook. All ways are good to him. From his early steps at the crossing of the ways, he dominated the country and shed his light on all sides without laying siege to any particular part. He is not one of those who impose on life and art a voluntary idealism, either violent or patient, nor is he one of those who inscribe in the book of life the formula of their campaign. He is of the kind who drink in the life universal, assimilating it to themselves. His artistic will is mainly objective. His genius adapts itself to 1,000 images of passing events, to the nation, to the times in which he lived, even to the fashions of his day. It accommodates itself to the various influences, ignoring all obstacles. It weighs other styles and other thoughts, but such is the power of assimilation, and the prevailing equilibrium of his nature, that he never feels submerged and overweighted by the mass of these strange elements. Everything is duly absorbed, controlled, and classified. This immense soul is like the sea itself, into which all the rivers of the world pour themselves without troubling its serenity. The German geniuses have often had this power of absorbing thoughts in strange forms, but it is excessively rare to find amongst them the grand objectivism and this superior impersonality which is, so to speak, the hallmark of Handel. Their sentimental lyricism is better fitted to sing songs, to voice the thoughts of the universe in song, than to paint the universe in living forms and vital rhythms. Handel is very different and approaches much more nearly than any other in Germany the genius of the South, the Homeric genius of which Goethe received a sudden revelation on his arrival at Naples. This capacious mind looks out on the whole universe and on the way the universe depicts itself, as a picture is reflected in calm and clear water. He owes much of this objectivism to Italy, where he spent many years, and the fascination of which never effaced itself from his mind, and he owes even more to that sturdy England which guards its emotions with so tight a rein, and which eschews those sentimental and effervescing effusions so often displayed in the pious German art. But that he had all the germs of his art in himself is already shown in his early works at Hamburg. From his infancy at Halle, Zachau had trained him not in one style, but in all the styles of the different nations, leading him to understand not only the spirit of each great composer, but to assimilate the styles by writing in various manners. This education, essentially cosmopolitan, was completed by his 3 tours in Italy and his sojourn of half a century in England. Above all, he never ceased to follow up the lessons learned at Halle, always appropriating to himself the best from all artists and their works. If he was never in France, it is not absolutely proved, he knew her nevertheless. He was anxious to master their language and musical style. We have proofs of that in his manuscripts and in the accusations made against him by certain French critics. Wherever he passed, he gathered some musical souvenir, buying and collecting foreign works, copying them, or rather, for he had not the careful patience of J.S. Bach, who scrupulously wrote out in his own hand the entire scores of the French organists and the Italian violinists, copying down in hasty and often inexact expressions any idea which struck him in the course of his reading. This vast collection of European thoughts, which only remains in remnants at the Fitzwilliam Museum at Cambridge, was the reservoir, so to speak, from which his creative genius continually fed itself. Profoundly German in race and character, he had become a world citizen, like his compatriot Leibniz, whom he had known at Hanover, a European with a tendency for the Latin culture. The great Germans at the end of that century, Goethe and Herder, were never more free or more universal than this great Saxon in music, saturated as he was with all the artistic thoughts of the West. He drew not only from the sources of learned and refined music, the music of musicians, but also drank deeply from the founts of popular music, that of the most simple and rustic folk. He loved the latter. One finds noted down in his manuscripts the street cries of London, and he once told a friend that he received many inspirations for his best airs from them. Certain of his oratorios, like L'Allegro ed il Penseroso, are threaded with remembrances of his walks in the English country, and who can ignore the pifferare Italian peasant's pipe in the Messiah, the Flemish carillon in Saul, the joyous popular Italian songs in Hercules and in Alexander Balu. Handel was not an artist lost in introspection. He watched all around him. He listened and observed. Sight was for him a source of inspiration, hardly of less importance than hearing. I do not know any great German musician who has been as much a visual as Handel. Like Hasse and Corelli, he had a veritable passion for beautiful pictures. He hardly ever went out without going to a theater or to a picture sale. He was a connoisseur, and he made a collection in which some Rembrandts were found after his death. It has been remarked that his blindness, which should have rendered his hearing still more sensitive, his creative powers translating everything into sonorous dreams, soon paralyzed his hearing when its principal source of renewal was withdrawn. Thus saturated in all the European music of his time, impregnated with the music of musicians, and the still richer music which flows in all nature herself, which is specially diffused in the vibrations of light and shade, that song of the rivers, of the forest, of the birds, in which all his works abound, and which have inspired some of his most picturesque pages with a semi-romantic color. He wrote as one speaks, he composed as one breathes. He never sketched out on paper in order to prepare his definite work. He wrote straight off as he improvised, and in truth he seems to have been the greatest improviser that ever was. Whether extemporizing on the organ at the midday services in St. Paul's Cathedral, or playing the capriccios during the entr'actes of his oratorios at Covent Garden, or improvising on the clavier in the orchestra at the opera at Hamburg or in London, or when he accompanied the singers in a most marvelous fashion, adapting himself to their temperament and virtuosity without having any written notes, he astounded the connoisseurs of his time, and Matheson, who may hardly be suspected of any indulgence towards him, proclaimed that he had no equal in this. One can truly say that he improvised every minute of his life. He wrote his music with such an impetuosity of feeling and such a wealth of ideas that his hand was constantly lagging behind his thoughts, and in order to keep pace with them at all he had to note them down in an abbreviated manner. But, and this seems contradictory, he had at the same time an exquisite sense of form. No German surpassed him in the art of writing beautiful melodic lines. Mozart and Hasse alone were his equals in this. It was to this love of perfection that we attribute that habit which, despite his fertility of invention, causes him to use time after time the same phrases, those most important and dearest to him, each time introducing an imperceptible change, a light stroke of the pencil, which renders them more perfect. The examination of these kinds of musical old fortes in their successive states is very instructive for the musician who is interested in plastic beauty. It shows also how certain melodies, once written down, continued to slumber in Handel's mind for many years until they had penetrated his subconscious nature, were applied at first by following the chances of his inspiration to a certain situation, which suited them moderately well. They are, so to speak, in search of a body where they can reincarnate themselves, seeking the true situation, the real sentiment of which they are but the latent expression, and once having found it, they expand themselves with ease. Handel worked no less with the music of other composers than with his own. If one had the time to study here what superficial readers have called his plagiarisms, particularly taking, for example, Israel and Egypt, where the most barefaced of these cases occur, one would see with what genius and insight Handel has evoked from the very depths of these musical phrases their secret soul, of which the first creators had not even a presentiment. It needed his eye or his ear to discover in the Serenade of Stradella its biblical cataclysms, each read and heard a work of art as it is, and yet not as it is. And one may conclude that it is not always the creator himself who has the most fertile idea of it. The example of Handel well proves this. Not only did he create music, but very often he created that of others for them. Stradella and Erba were only for him, however humiliating the comparison, the flames of fire, and the cracks in the wall through which Leonardo saw the living figures. Handel heard great storms passing through the gentle quivering of Stradella's guitar. This evocatory character of Handel's genius should never be forgotten. He who is satisfied with listening to this music without seeing what it expresses, who judges this art as a purely formal art, who does not feel his expressive and suggestive power, occasionally, so far as hallucination, will never understand it. It is a music which paints emotions, souls, and situations, to see the epochs and the places, which are the framework of the emotions, and which tint them with their own peculiar moral tone. In a word, his is an art essentially picturesque and dramatic. It is scarcely 20 to 30 years since the key to it was found in Germany, thanks to the Handel musical festivals. As Heuss says, concerning a recent performance at Leipzig, for a proper comprehension, no master more than Handel has greater need of being performed, and well performed. One can study J.S. Bach at home, and enjoy it even more than at a good concert, but he who has never heard Handel well performed can with difficulty imagine what he really is, for really good performances of Handel are excessively rare. The intimate sense of his works was falsified in the century which followed his death by the English interpretations, strengthened further still in Germany by those of Mendelssohn and his numerous following, by the exclusion of and systematic contempt for all the operas of Handel, by an elimination of nearly all the dramatic oratorios, the most powerful and the freshest, by a narrow choice, more and more restrained to the 4 or 5 oratorios, and even here, by giving an exaggerated supremacy to the Messiah, by the interpretation finally of these works, and notably of the Messiah in a pompous, rigid, and stolid manner, with an orchestra and choir far too numerous and badly balanced, with singers frightfully correct and pious, without any feeling or intimacy. There has been established that tradition which makes Handel a church musician, after the style of Louis XIV, all decoration, pompous columns, noble and cold statues, and pictures by Lebrun. It is not surprising that this has reduced works executed on such principles and degraded them to a monumental tiresomeness, similar to that which emanates from the bewigged Alexanders and the very conventional Christs of Lebrun. It is necessary to turn back. Handel was never a church musician, and he hardly ever wrote for the church. Apart from his psalms and his Te Deum, composed for the private chapels and for exceptional events, he only wrote instrumental music for concerts and for open-air fêtes, for operas, and for those so-called oratorios, which were really written for the theater. The first oratorios he composed were really acted, Axis and Galatea in May 1732 at the Haymarket Theatre, with scenery, decoration, and costumes under the title of English Pastoral Opera, Esther, in February 1732 at the Academy of Ancient Music, after the manner of the Grecian tragedy, the chorus being placed behind the stage and the orchestra. And if Handel resolutely abstained from theatrical representation, which alone gives the full value to certain scenes, such as the orgy and the dream of Belshazzar, expressly conceived for acting, on the other hand, he stood out firmly for having his oratorios at the theater and not in the church. There were not wanting churches any less than dissenting chapels in which he could give his works, and by not doing so he turned against him the opinion of religious people who considered it sacrilegious to carry pious subjects onto the stage. But he continued to affirm that he did not write compositions for the church, but worked for the theater, a free theater. This briefly dramatic character of Handel's works has been well comprehended by the German historians who have studied him during recent times. Chrysler compares him to Shakespeare. Kretschmar calls him the reformer of musical drama, Holbach and Ehoyes see in him a dramatic musician and claim for the performance of his oratorios dramatic singers. Richard Strauss, in his introduction to Berlioz's Treatise of Orchestration, opposes the great polyphonic and symphonic stream issuing from J.S. Bach with that homophonic and dramatic one which comes from Handel. We hope that the readers of this little book have found here in nearly all these pages a confirmation of these ideas. It remains for us, after having attempted to indicate the general characteristics of Handel's art, to sketch the technique of the different styles in which he worked. To speak truly, it is difficult to speak of the opera or of the oratorio of Handel. It is necessary to say of the operas or of the oratorios, for we do not find that they point back to any single type. We can verify here what we said at the commencement of this chapter about the magnificent vitality of Handel in choosing amongst his art forms the different directions of the music of his times. All the European tendencies at that time are reflected in his operas, the model of Kaiser in his early works, the Venetian model in his Agrippina, the model of Scarlatti and Steffani in his first early operas. In the London works, he soon introduces English influences, particularly in the rhythms. Then it was Bononcini whom he rivaled. Again, those great attempts of genius to create a new musical drama, Giulio Cesare, Tamerlano, Orlando. Later on, those charming ballet operas inspired by France, Ariodante, Alcina. Later still, those operas which point towards the opera comique and the light style of the second half of the century, Serse Daidamia. Handel continued to try every other style without making any permanent choice, as did Gluck, with whom alone he can be compared. Without doubt, and it is his greatest fault in the theater, he was constrained by the conventions of the Italian opera at Tunes, and by the composition of his troupe of singers, to overlook his choruses, and to write operas for solo voices, of which the principal roles were cast for the prima donna and for the contralto. But whenever he could, he wrote his operas with choruses, like Ariodante, Alcina, and he only owed it to himself that he did not give to the tenor or to the bass their place in the concert of voices. If it was not possible to break the uniformity of the solo voices by the addition of choruses, still he enlivened these solos by the flexibility and the variety of his instrumental accompaniments. Such of his most celebrated airs as the garden scene in Rinaldo, Agoletti, Che Cantata, are only in truth an orchestral tone picture. The voice mingles itself only as an instrument, and with what art Handel always decides his melodies in disengaging the beautiful lines, drawing all the parts possible in pure tone colors from single instruments, and from the voice isolated, then united, and what of his silences. The appeal of his melodies is much more varied than one usually believes. If the da capo form abounds in his works, it is necessary to admit that it was practically the only one of that period. In Elmira, Handel uses the form of a little strophic song very happily. For this, Kaiser supplied him with models, and he never renounces the use of these little melodies, so simple and touching, almost bare, which speak direct to the soul. He seems to return to them even with special predilection in his last operas, Atalanta, Justina, Serse, Daidamia. He gives also to Hassa and to Graun the model of his 6 cavatinas, airs in 2 parts, which they later on brought into prominence. We find his dramatic airs also have the second part and the repeat. Even in the da capo, however, he gives us a variety of forms. Not only does Handel use all styles, but how well does he blend the voices with the instruments in those airs of great brilliance and free virtuosity. With what predilection does he ply all these beautiful and learned contrapuntal tissues, as in the Cara Sposa from Rinaldo, or the Ombra Cara from Radamisto. But he ever seeks new combinations for the old form. He was one of the first to adopt little airs da capo, with which Bononcini seems to have been so much the fashion at the commencement of the 18th century, and of which Agrippina and Ottone furnish such delightful examples. To the second part of the air he gave a different character and movement from that of the first part. Still further, in either of the parts several movements were combined. Sometimes the second part was recitative, or it was extremely condensed. When Handel had choruses at his disposal in his oratorios, he often entrusted the da capo to the chorus. He went further. In Samson, after Micah has sung in the second act the first two parts of the air, Return, O God of Hosts, the chorus takes up the second part at the same time as Micah returns to the first part. Finally, he attempts to divide the da capo between two characters. Thus, in the second act of Saul, Jonathan's solo, Sin not, O King, against the youth, is followed by Saul's solo, then appearing note for note. But the most glorious feat of Handel in vocal solos is the recitative scene. It was Kaiser who taught him the art of those moving recitative ariosi with orchestra, which he had already used in Elmira, and of which, later on, J.S. Bach was to take from him the style. He never ceased to employ it in his London operas, and he gave the form a superb amplitude. They are not merely isolated recitatives or preambles to an extended solo. The story of Caesar in the third act of Giulio Cesare, Dall'ondoso Periglio, is one large musical picture, which expresses in its frame a symphonic prelude, a recitative, the two first parts of an air over the symphonic accompaniment of the opening, a second recitative, then the da capo. The scene of Bajazet's death in the last act of Tamerlano is composed of a series of recitatives with orchestra and of airs joined together, and passes through all the nuances of feeling, forming from one stage to the other a veritable ladder of life. The scene of Admetus's agony at the opening of the opera of the same name equals in profundity, emotion, and dramatic liberty the finest recitative scenes of Gluck. The mad scene in Orlando and that of Deianira's despair in the third act of Hercules surpasses them in boldness of realism and frenetic passion. In the first, burlesque and tragic elements commingle with a truly Shakespearean art. The second is a mighty foaming river, raging with fury and grief. Neither of these two scenes have any analogy in the whole of the musical theater of the 18th century. And Teseo, Rodelinda, Alessandro, Alcina, Semele, Joseph, Alexander Balut, Jepta all present recitative scenes or combinations in the same scene of recitatives and very free airs with instrumental interludes no less original. Finally, a sort of presentiment of the leitmotif and its psychological employment in Belshazzar should be noticed, where certain instrumental phrases and recitatives seem attached to the character of Nitocris. The study of Handel's recitatives and airs raises perhaps the greatest problem of artistic interpretation, that of vocal ornamentation. We know that Handelian singers used to decorate his melodies with graces and melismatic figures and cadenzas, often very considerable, which have disappeared for the greater part. Christander, in editing Handel's works, found them given as alternatives, and either suppressed them, those which were false to the historic sense of the text, or else rewrote them himself. It was in this last point that he stopped short of all possible guarantees of exactness, or at least of true resemblance, but his revisions found few supporters, and a discussion on his treatment of this subject has been recently raised amongst German musical writers. This debate, the examination of which cannot be entered into in this volume, authorized, it seems, the following conclusions. 1. The vocal ornaments were not improvised and left to the fancy of the singer, as is often asserted, but they were marked with precise indications in the singer's parts and also in the score of the accompanying clavecinist. 2. They were not mere caprices of empty virtuosity, but the result of a reflective virtuosity, and subject to the general style of the piece. They served to accentuate more deeply the expression of the principal melodic lines. Yet what would be the advantage of restoring these ornaments? Our taste has changed since then, and a stricter reverence forbids us to risk tampering with works of the past by following slavishly such details of tradition and habit which have become meaningless and old-fashioned. Is it better to impose on the public of today the older works with all their marks of age, improved away by the learning of later generations, or to adapt them soberly in the manner of true feeling, so as to enable them to continue to exercise on us their elevating power? Both sides have been well supported. For myself, I consider the first proposition bears on the publication of the scores, and the second on the musical renderings. The mind ought to seek and find out exactly what used to be the case, but when this is done, the living are justified in claiming their rights, and by being allowed to reject ancient usages, only preserving such as render these works of genius truly vital. The vocal ensemble pieces hold a much humbler place in Italian opera, and Handel has made fewer innovations on this ground than in the vocal solo. However, one finds some very interesting experiments here. His duets are often written in an imitative style, serious and rather sad, in the old Italian school of Provenzale and Steffani, or in the Lully style, where the two voices mingle together note by note with exactitude. But Atalanta and Porro furnish us also with duets of an alluring freedom and uncommon artistry, and in the duet in the third act of Orlando, Handel attempts to differentiate the characters of the weeping Angelica and the furious Rolland. Similarly, with the trios written in the strict style of imitation, like that in Valcina, Act 3, the trio in Axis and Galatea carefully defines the couple of lovers from the colossal figure of Polyphemus. The trio in Tamerlano contrasts the exasperated Tamerlano with Bajazet and with Asteria, who aggravated him. And the trio in the Judgment of Solomon distinguishes the three diverse characters, the calm power of Solomon, the aggressive cries of the wicked mother, and the sorrowful supplications of the good mother. The trio from Susanna is no less free, but in the humorous style. One of the two old men madrigalises, whilst the other menaces. The ensemble forms altogether a most vivid little scene which Mozart himself would not have disowned. Quartets are rare. There are two little ones in The Triumph of Time, written in Rome. In Radamisto, Handel made the attempt at a dramatic quartet, but rather clumsily, and with repeated da capo. The most moving quartet is found in the second act of Jephthah. It is in Jephthah, also Act 3, where the only quintet which he wrote is to be found. The choruses in the Italian opera of the 18th century were reduced to a rudimentary stage, and they consist merely of the union of the voices of soloists at the end of a piece, with certain banal and brilliant acclamations during the course of the action. Notwithstanding this, Handel wrote some stronger ones in Alcina. Those of Giulio Cesare, Ariodante, and Atalanta were also exceptional in the operas of his time. So with the final choruses, Handel arranged after a fashion to escape from the current banality. That of Tamerlano is written in a melancholy dramatic vein. That of Orlando strives to preserve the individual character of their personality. That of Giulio Cesare is tacked on to a duet. There are also choruses of people, the Matalots in Giustino, that of the hunters in Didamia, where the choruses take up the refrain from the air announced by the solo voice. It is the same in Alessandro, where the soldier's chorus repeats Alessandro's hymn, slightly curtailed. Finally, Handel frequently attempted to build up great musical architecture, raising it by successive stages from solos to ensemble pieces, and then to choruses. At the end of the first act of Ariodante, a duet, Gavotte style, is taken up by the chorus, then danced without voices, finally sung and danced. The close of Act 3 from the same opera gives us a chain of processions, dances, and choruses. The final scenes of Alessandro constitute a veritable opera finale, two duets and a trio running into a chorus. But it is in his oratorios that Handel attempted these ensemble vocal combinations on the larger scale, and principally that mixture of movements where the powerful contrasts of soli and chorus are grouped together in the same picture. one sees what a variety of forms and styles he used. Handel was too universal and too objective to believe that one kind of art only was the true one. He believed in two kinds of music only, the good and the bad. Apart from that, he appreciated all styles. Thus he has left masterpieces in every style, but he did not open any new way in opera for the simple reason that he went a long way in nearly all paths already opened up. Constantly he experimented, invented, and always with his singularly sure touch. He seemed to have an extraordinary penetrating knowledge in invention, and consequently few artistic regions remained for him to conquer. He made as masterly a use of the recitative as Gluck, or of the arioso as Mozart, writing the acts of Tamerlano, which are the closest and most heart-rending dramas, in the manner of Iphigenia and Tauride, the most moving and passionate scenes in music, such as certain pages of Admetto and Orlando, where the humorous and tragic are intermingled in the manner of Don Giovanni. He has experimented very happily here in new rhythms. There were new forms, the dramatic duet or quartet, the descriptive symphony opening the opera, refined orchestration, choruses and dances. Nothing seems to have obsessed him. In the following opera, we find him returning to the ordinary forms of the Italian or German opera of his time. Still less can we say that he held to a rigid form with his operas, which were continually adapted to the changing tastes of the theater public of his age, and of the singers which he had at his disposal. But when he left the opera for the oratorio, he varied no less. It was a perpetual experiment of new forms in the vast framework of the free theater, Théâtre en Liberté, of the concert drama, and the sort of instinctive ebb and flow in creation seems to have caused his works to succeed one another in groups of analogous or related compositions, each work in a nearly opposite style of feeling and form. In each one, Handel indulged momentarily in a certain side of his feelings, and when that was finished, he found himself in the possession of other feelings which had been accumulating whilst he was drawing on his first. He thus kept up a perpetual balance, which is like the pulsation of life itself. After the realistic Saul comes the impersonal epic of Israel and Egypt. After this colossal monument appear the two little genre pictures, the Ode to Cecilia and L'Allegro ed Penseroso. After the Herculean Samson, an heroic and popular tragic comedy, sprang forth the charming Flower of Semele, an opera of romanticism and gallantry. But if the oratorios are so wonderfully varied, they have one characteristic in common, even more than the operas. They are musical dramas. It was not that religious thought turned Handel to this choice of biblical subjects, but as Kretschmar has well shown, it was on account of the stories of the Bible heroes being a part of the very lifeblood of the people whom he addressed. They were known to all, whilst the ancient romantic stories could only interest a society of refined and spoilt dilettanti. Without doubt, these oratorios were not made for representation, did not seek scenic effects, with rare exceptions, as for instance the scene of the orgy of Belshazzar, where one feels that Handel had drawn on the direct vision of theatrical representation, but passions, spirits, and personalities were represented always in a dramatic fashion. Handel is a great painter of characters, and the Delilah in Samson, the Nitocris in Belshazzar, the Cleopatra in Alexander Balus, the Mother in Solomon, the Dejanira in Hercules, the beautiful Theodora, all bear witness to the suppleness and the profundity of his psychological genius. If in the course of the action and the depicting of the ordinary sentiments he abandoned himself freely to the flow of pure music, in the moments of passionate crises he is the equal of the greatest masters in musical drama. Is it necessary to mention the terrible scenes in the third act of Hercules, the beautiful scenes of Alexander Balus, the dream of Belshazzar, the scenes of Juno, and the death of Semele, the recognition of Joseph and his brothers, the destruction of the temple in Samson, the second act of Jephthah, the prison scenes in Theodora, or in the first act of Saul, and dominating all, like great pictures, certain of the choruses in Israel and Egypt, in Esther, and in Joshua, and in the Chandos anthems, which seem veritable tempests of passion, great upheavals of overpowering effect. It is by these choruses that the oratorio is essentially distinguished from the opera. It is in the first place a choral tragedy. These choruses, which are nearly eliminated in Italian opera during the time of the Barberini, held a very important place in French opera, but their role was limited to that of commentator or else merely decorative. In the oratorio of Handel, they became the very life and soul of the work. Sometimes they took the part of the ancient classical chorus, which exposed the thought of the drama when the hidden fates led on the heroes to their destinies, as in Saul, Hercules, Alexander Balus, Susanna. Sometimes they added to the shock of human passions the powerful appeal of religion, and crowned the human drama with a supernatural aureola, as in Theodora and Jephthah. Or finally they became the actual actors themselves, or the enemy people and the god who guided them. It is remarkable that in his very first oratorio Esther, Handel had this stroke of genius. In the choruses, there we see the drama of an oppressed people, and their God who led them by his voice, superbly depicted. In Deborah and Atalia also, two nations are in evidence. In Belshazzar there are three. But in his chief work of this kind, Israel and Egypt, the greatest choral epic which exists, is entirely occupied by Jehovah and his people. The choruses are in the most diverse styles. Some are in the church style and a little antiquated. Others tend towards the opera, even the opera buffa. Some exhale the perfume of the madrigals at the end of the 16th century, and the Academy of Ancient Music in London sought to sustain this art in honor. On the other hand, Handel has frequently used them in the form of a chorale, simple or varied above all. He employs the choral double fugue in a most astounding manner, and he carries everything on with that impetuosity of genius which drew to him the admiration of the sternest critics of his time, such as Matheson. His instinct as a great constructor loved to alternate homophonic music with fugal choruses, the massive columns of musical harmony with the moving contrapuntal in superimposed strata, very cleverly framing his dramatic choruses in a most imposing architecture of decorative and impersonal character. His choruses are sometimes tragic scenes or comedy, see the vaudeville, sometimes genre pictures. Handel knew most admirably how to weave in popular motifs, or to mingle the dance with the song. But what belongs chiefly to him, not that he invented it, but made the happiest use of it, is a musical architecture of solo and chorus, alternating and intermingled. Purcell and the French composers had given him this idea. He attempted it in his earliest religious works, especially in his birthday ode for Queen Anne, 1713, where nearly every solo air is taken up again by the following chorus. He had a great feeling for light, and pleased himself by introducing in the middle of his choral masses solo songs, which soared up into the air like birds. His dramatic genius knew, when required, how to draw from this combination the most astounding effects. Thus in the Passion after Bacchus, 1716, where the dialogue of the daughter of Sion and the chorus Eilt ihr angefochten Seelen, with its questions, its responses, its Aeschylean interjections, served as Bach's model for his St. Matthew Passion. At the end of Israel in Egypt, after those great choral mountains of sounds, by an ingenious contrast, a female voice is heard alone without accompaniment, and then a hymn alternating with a chorus, which repeats it. It is the same again at the end of the little short ode to Saint Cecilia. In the occasional oratorio, a duet for soprano and alto alternates with the choruses, but it is in Judas Maccabeus where he best achieves this combination of solos and the chorus, in this victorious epic of an invaded people who rose up and overcame their oppressors. The individualities are scarcely distinguished from the heroic soul of the nation, and the chiefs of the people are only the choralists, whose songs set dancing the enormous ensembles which unfold themselves in powerful and irresistible progressions, like a giant's procession up a triumphal staircase. It follows then that when the orchestra is added to the dialogue of solos and of choruses, the third element enters into the psychological drama, sometimes in apparent opposition to the two others. Thus, in the second act of Judas Maccabeus, the orchestra which sounds the battle calls makes a vivid contrast to the somewhat funereal choruses on which they are interposed. We hear the pleasing, dreadful call, or to put it better, they complete them and fill in the picture. After death, glory. The oratorio being a free theater, it becomes necessary for the music to supply the place of the scenery. Thus, its picturesque and descriptive role is strongly developed, and it is by this above all that Handel's genius so struck the English public. Camille Saint-Saëns wrote in an interesting letter to C. Belaige, "I have come to the conclusion that it is the picturesque and descriptive side, until then novel and unreached, whereby Handel achieved the astonishing favor which he enjoyed. This masterly way of writing choruses, of treating the fugue, had been done by others. What really counts with him is the color, that modern element which we no longer hear in him. He knew nothing of exotism, but look at Alexander's Feast, Israel in Egypt, and especially L'Allegro ed Penseroso, and try to forget all that has been done since. You find at every turn a striving for the picturesque, for an effect of imitation. It is real and very intense for the medium in which it is produced, and it seems to have been unknown hitherto. Perhaps Saint-Saëns lays too much weight on the masterly way of writing his choruses, which was not so common in England, even with Purcell. Perhaps he accentuates too much also the real influence of the French in matters of picturesque and descriptive music, and the influence which it exerted on Handel. Finally, it is not necessary to represent these descriptive tendencies of Handel as exceptional in his time. A great breadth of nature passed over German music and pushed it towards tone painting. Telemann was, even more than Handel, a painter in music, and was more celebrated than Handel for his realistic effects. But the England of the 18th century had remained very conservative in music, and had devoted itself to cultivating the masters of the past. Handel's art was then more striking to them on account of its color and its imitative effects. I will not say with Saint-Saëns that there was no question of exotism with him, for Handel seems to have sought this very thing more than once, notably in the orchestration of certain scenes for the two Cleopatras, of Giulio Cesare and of Alexander Balus. But that which was constantly with him was tone painting, the reproduction through passages of music of natural impressions, a painting very characterized, and as Beethoven put it, more an expression of feelings than of painting, a poetic evocation of the raging tempests, of the tranquility of the sea, of the dark shades of night, of the twilight which envelops the English country, of the parks by moonlight, of the sunrise in springtime, and of the awakening of birds. Axis and Galatea, Israel in Egypt, Allegro, the Messiah, Semele, Joseph, Solomon, Susanna, all offer a wondrous picture gallery of nature, carefully noted by Handel with the sure stroke of a Flemish painter and of a romantic poet at the same time. This romanticism struck powerfully on his time with a strength which would not be denied. It drew upon him both admiration and violent criticism. A letter of 1751 depicts him as a Berlioz or Wagner, raising storms by his orchestra and chorus. He cannot give people pleasure after the proper fashion, writes this anonymous author in his letter, and his evil genius will not allow him to do this. He imagines a new grandioso kind of music, and in order to make more noise, he has it executed by the greatest number of voices and instruments which one has ever heard before in a theater. He thinks thus to rival not only the god of musicians, but even all the other gods, like Iola, Neptune, and Jupiter. For either I expected that the house would be brought down by his tempest, or that the sea would engulf the whole. But more unbearable still was his thunder. Never have such terrible rumblings fallen on my head. Similarly, Goethe, irritated and upset, said, after having heard the first movement of the Beethoven C minor symphony, "It is meaningless. One expected the house to fall about one's ears." It is not by chance that I couple the names of Handel and Beethoven. Handel is a kind of Beethoven in chains. He had the unapproachable manner, like the great Italian artists who surrounded him, the Porporas, the Hasses, and between him and them there was a whole world. Under the classic ideal with which he covered himself burned a romantic genius, precursor of the Sturm und Drang period, and sometimes this hidden demon broke out in brusque fits of passion, perhaps despite himself. End of section 7. Section 8 of Handel by Romain Rolland, translated by Arthur Eaglefield Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. His Technique and Works, Part 2. Handel's instrumental music deserves very close notice, for it is nearly always wrongly assessed by historians and badly understood by artists who treat it for the most part as a merely formal art. Its chief characteristic is that of a perpetual improvisation. If it was published, it was more in spite of Handel than at his instigation. It was not made to be played and judged coldly, but to be produced at white heat to the public. They were free sketches, in which the form was never completely tightened up, but remained always moving and living, modifying itself at the concert, as the two sensibilities, the artist and the public, came into touch with one another. It is necessary then to preserve in this music a certain measure of the character of living improvisation. What we too often do, on the contrary, is to petrify them. One cannot say that they are a caricature of the work of Handel. They are rather a negation of it. When one studies with a minute care every detail of the work, when one has attained from the orchestra a precision of attack, an ensemble, a justness, an irreproachable finish, we have yet done nothing more than raise up the mere figure of this genial improvisator. Further, there is with his instrumental music, as with his vocal music, nearly always an intimate and picturesque expression. For Handel, as with his friend Gimignani, the aim of instrumental music is not only to please the ear, but to express the sentiments, the emotions, to paint the feelings. It reflects not only the interior world, but it also turns to the actual spectacle of things. It is a precise poetry, and if one cannot define the sources of his inspiration, one can often find in certain of his instrumental works the souvenir of days and journeys, and of scenes visited and experienced by Handel. It was here that he was visibly inspired by nature. Others have a relationship with vocal and dramatic works. Certain of the heroic fugues in the fourth book of the clavier pieces, published in 1735, were taken up again by Handel in his Israel in Egypt, and clothed with words which agree precisely with their hidden feeling. The first allegro from the fourth organ concerto, the first book appeared in 1738, soon became shortly afterwards one of the prettiest of the choruses in Alcina. The second and monumental concerto for two horns in F major is a reincarnation of some of the finest pages from Esther. It was quite evident to the public of his time that the instrumental works had an expressive meaning, or that, as Gimignani wrote, all good music ought to be an imitation of a fine discourse. Thus the publisher Walsh was justified in issuing his 6 volumes of favorite airs from Handel's operas and oratorios, arranged as sonatas for the flute, violin, and harpsichord, and Handel himself, or his pupil W. Babel, arranged excellently for the clavier some suites of airs from the operas, binding them together with preludes, interludes, and variations. It is necessary always to keep in view this intimate relation of the instrumental works of Handel with the rest of his music. It ought to draw our attention more and more to the expressive contents of these works. The instrumental music of Handel divides itself into 3 classes. Firstly, music for the clavier, the clavecin and organ. Secondly, chamber music, sonatas and trios. Thirdly, orchestral music. The compositions for clavier are the most popular works of any that Handel wrote, and these have achieved the greatest number of European editions. Although they comprise 3 volumes, yet there is only one, the first which represents him properly, for it is the only one which he prepared himself and supervised. The others, more or less fraudulently published, misrepresent him. This first volume, published in November 1720, under the French title Suites, etc., affords us the means of appreciating the 2 most striking of Handel's traits, his precocious maturity, which hardly developed at all in the course of time, and the European universality of character, which distinguished his art even at an epoch when the great artists were less national than they are today. For the first trait, one would remark, in fine, that these clavier pieces published in 1720 had already been written some time, certainly before 1700. One discovers a part of them in the Jugendbuch of the Leonard collection. Others come from Elmira, 1705. Naturally, Handel enlarged and revised, and carefully grouped all these pieces in his edition of 1720. The interest of the Jugendbuch is chiefly that it shows us the first sketches of the pieces and how Handel perfected them. Side by side with the oldest pieces, there are others more recent, composed, it may be, in Italy or in England. One can trace in these pages the course of the different influences. Seifert and Fleischer have noted some of them. German influences, French and Italian. In England even, sometimes Italian elements, sometimes German, predominated with him. The order of the dances varies in each suite, and also the central point, the kernel of the work. The introductory pieces are sometimes preludes, sometimes fugues, overtures, etc. The dances and the airs are sometimes related to one another and sometimes independent, and nevertheless the prevailing impression of the work, so varied in its texture, is its complete unity. The personality of Handel holds it all together and welds the most diverse elements, polyphony and richness of German harmony, Italian homophony and Scarlattian technique, the French rhythm and ornamentation with English directness and practicability. Thus the work made its impression on the times. Before this time, there had perhaps been more original volumes of pieces for the clavier, but their inspiration was nearly always very much circumscribed by the limits of their national art. Handel was the first of the great German classics of the 18th century. He did for music what the French writers and philosophers of the 18th century did for literature. He wrote for all and sundry, and his volume took the place, on the day of its publication, which it has held since, that of a European classic. The following volumes are less interesting for the reasons I have given. The second volume, published in 1733 by Walsh, unknown to Handel, and in a very faulty manner, gives us little pieces which we find in the Jugendbuch, and which date from the time of Hamburg and Halle. They lack the setting which Handel had certainly planned for them, preludes and fugues. This arrangement was ready, and Handel, frustrated by this publisher, resigned himself to publishing them later on, as an appendix to the preceding work. 6 fugues or voluntaries for the organ or harpsichord, 1735, opus 3. These fugues date from the time when Handel was at Cannons, before 1720. The second, in G major, was from the period of his first sojourn in England. They became celebrated at once and were much circulated in manuscript even in Germany. Handel had trained himself in fugue in the school of Kuhnau, and especially with Johann Krieger. Like them, he gave his fugues an essentially melodic character. They are so suited for singing that 2 of them, as we have said, afterwards served for 2 choruses in the first part of Israel, but Handel's compositions possess a far different vitality from that of his German forerunners. They have a charming intrepidity, a fury, a passion, a fire which belongs only to him. In other words, they live. All the notes talk, says Matheson. These fugues have the character of happy improvisations, and in truth they were improvised. Handel calls them voluntaries, that is, fanciful and learned caprices. He made frequent use of double fugues with a masterly development. Such an art rejoices the hearer and warms the heart towards the composer and towards the executant, says Matheson again, who, after having heard J.S. Bach, found Handel the greater in the composition of the double fugue and in improvisation. This habit of Handel, one might say almost a craving for improvising, was the origin of the grand organ concertos. After the fashion of his time, Handel conducted his operas and oratorios from the clavier. He accompanied the singers with a marvelous art, blending himself to their fancy, and when the singer had done, he delivered his version. From the interludes on the clavier in his operas, he passed to the fantasies, or caprices on the organ in the entr'actes of his oratorios, and his success was so great that he never again abandoned this custom. One might say that the public were drawn to his oratorios more by his improvisations on the organ than by the oratorios themselves. 2 volumes of the organ concertos were published during the lifetime of Handel, in 1738 and in 1740, the third a little after his death, in 1760. To judge them properly, it is necessary to bear in mind that they were destined for the theatre. It would be absurd to expect works in the strict, vigorous, and involved style of J.S. Bach. They were brilliant divertissements, of which the style, somewhat commonplace, yet luminous and pompous, preserves the character of oratorio improvisations, finding their immediate effect on the great audience. When he gave a concerto, says Hawkins, his method in general was to introduce it with a voluntary movement on the diapasons, which stole on the ear in a slow and solemn progression, the harmony close wrought and as full as could possibly be expressed, the passages concatenated with stupendous art, the whole at the same time being perfectly intelligible and carrying the appearance of great simplicity. This kind of prelude was succeeded by the concerto itself, which he executed with a degree of spirit and firmness that no one can ever pretend to equal. Even at the height of the cabal which was organized against Handel, the Grub Street Journal published an enthusiastic poem on Handel's organ concertos. O winds, softly, softly raise your golden wings among the branches, that all may be silent. Make even the whisperings of zephyrs to cease. Sources of life, suspend your course. Listen, listen, Handel the incomparable plays. O look, when he, the powerful man, makes the forces of the organ resound, joy assembles its cohorts, malice is appeased. His hand, like that of the Creator, conducts his noble work with order, with grandeur and reason. Silence, bunglers in art. It is nothing here to have the favor of great lords. Here, Handel is king. It is necessary then to view these organ concertos in the proper sense of magnificent concerts for a huge public. Great shadows, great lights, strong and joyous contrasts, all are conceived in view of a colossal effect. The orchestra usually consists of 2 oboes, 2 violins, viola and basses, violoncellos, bassoons, and cembalo, occasionally 2 flutes, some contrabassos, and a harp. The concertos are in 3 or 4 movements, which are generally connected in pairs. Usually they open with a pomposo or a staccato, in the style of the French overture. Often an allegro in the same style follows. For the conclusion, an allegro moderato or an andante, somewhat animated, sometimes some dances. The adagio in the middle is often missing, and is left to be improvised on the organ. The form has a certain relation with that of the sonata in 3 movements, allegro, adagio, allegro, preceded by an introduction. The first pieces of these 2 first concertos, published in volume 48 of the complete edition, 2nd volume, are in a picturesque and descriptive style. The long concerto in F major in the same volume has a swing of festival music, very closely allied to the open-air style. Finally, one must notice the beautiful experiment, unfortunately not continued, of the concerto for 2 organs, and that, more astonishing still, of a concerto for organ terminated by a chorus, thus opening the way for Beethoven's fine symphony, and to his successors, Berlioz, Liszt, and Mahler. The chamber music of Handel proves to be of the same precocious maturity as his clavier music. 6 sonatas in trio for 2 oboes and harpsichord appear to date from about 1696, when he was 11 years old, and while he was still at Halle, where he wrote, as he said, like the devil, above all for the oboe, his favorite instrument. They are in 4 movements, adagio, allegro, adagio, allegro. The slow movements are often very short, and the second between them is sometimes a mere transition. The sonata for viola da gamba and cembalo concertato in C major probably belongs to 1705, when Handel was at Hamburg. It is the only one of its kind in the works of Handel, which shows him as a forerunner of Bach. The sonata is in trio form. The clavier plays a second obbligato besides the bass part, as Seifert notes. 10 years before Bach worked at his sonatas with accompaniment for cembalo obbligato, Handel had already a clear perception of their value. 3 sonatas for flute and bass of an elegiac grace also perhaps date from the Halle period, and according to Christender seem to have been continued up to 1710 at Hanover. But the chief instrumental chamber works written by Handel were published in London between 1732 and 1740, and they comprise 3 volumes. 1. 15 sonatas or solos for a German flute, oboe, or violin, with a thorough bass for the harpsichord or bass violin, opus 1. 2. 9 sonatas or trios for 2 violins, flutes, or oboes, with a thorough bass for the harpsichord or violoncello, opus 2. 3. Sonatas or trios for 2 violins or German flutes, with a thorough bass for the harpsichord or violoncello, opus 5. The first volume contains very old pieces, of which some date from the time when Handel was at Burlington and Chandos. Others might have been intended for the Prince of Wales, whose violin teacher John Dubourg was a friend of Handel, as they date from about 1730. The second volume appeared at first in Amsterdam, afterwards in London with Walsh, under a French title in 1733. The third volume was composed in 1738 and published about the beginning of 1739. The first feature to notice, in general, is the want of definition in the choice of instruments for which this music was written. Following the same abstract aesthetic of his time, the composer left it to the players to choose the instruments. However, there was no doubt that in the first conception of Handel, certain of these pieces were made for the flute, others for the violin, and others for the oboe. In the volume Opus 1 of the solo sonatas for the flute or oboe or violin with bass, harpsichord, or violoncello, the usual form is generally in 4 movements, adagio, allegro, adagio, allegro. The slow pieces are very short. Several are inspired by the airs of Italian cantatas and operas. Some of the pieces are joined together. The harmony is often thin and requires to be filled in. The second and third volumes have a much greater value, containing trios or sonatas in 2 parts, for 2 violins or 2 oboes, or 2 flauti traversi, with bass, harpsichord, or violoncello. All the sonatas in the second volume, with only one exception, have 4 movements, 2 slow and 2 fast alternatively, as in the Opus 1. Sometimes they are inspired by the airs of the operas, or of the oratorios. At other times they have furnished a brief sketch for them. The elegiac Largo, which opens the first sonata, is found again in Alessandro. The allegro, which finishes the third sonata, forms one of the movements in the overture of Athalia. The larghetto of the fourth serves for the second movement of the Esther overture. Other pieces have been transferred to the clavier or other instrumental works, where they are joined to other movements. The finest of these trios are the first and the 9th, both of enchanting poetry. In the second movement of the 9th trio, Handel has utilized very happily a popular English theme. The 7 trios from the third volume afford a much greater variety in the style and in the number of the pieces. Dances occupy a great part. They are indeed veritable suites. They were composed in the years when Handel was attracted by the form of ballet opera. The musette and the allegro of the second sonata come from Ariodante. Some of the other slow and pompous movements are borrowed from his oratorios. The 2 allegri, which open the 4th sonata, are taken from the overture of Athalia. On the other hand, Handel inserts in the final movement of Belshazzar the beautiful andante which opens his first sonata. Whoever wishes to judge these works historically or from the intellectual point of view will find, like Crisander, that Handel has not invented here any new forms, and as he advanced, he returned to the form of the suite, which already belonged to the past, instead of continuing on his way towards the future sonata. But those who will judge them artistically, for their own personal charm, will find in them some of the purest creations of Handel, and those which best retain their freshness, their beautiful Italian lines, their delicate expression, their aristocratic simplicity are refreshing alike to the mind and to the heart. Our own epoch, tired of the post-Beethoven and post-Wagnerian art, can find here, as in the chamber music of Mozart, a safe haven, where it can escape the sterile agitation of the present and find again quiet peace and sanity. The orchestral music of Handel comprises 12 concerti grossi, 1740, the 6 oboe concertos, 1734, the symphonies from his operas, oratorios, and his open-air music, water music, 1715 or 1717, firework music, 1749, and concerti for 2 horns. Although Handel was in art a visualist, and though his music had a highly descriptive and evocatory power, he only made a very restrained use of instrumental tone color. However, he showed on occasion a refined intelligence in its use. The 2 oratorios written at Rome, when he found himself in the society of the Cardinal Ottoboni, and his great virtuoso works, The Triumph of Time and The Resurrection of 1708, have a fine and well-varied orchestration. In London, he was one of the first to introduce the use of the horn into the orchestra of the opera. He was the first, says Volbach, to assert the expressive personality of the violoncello. From the viola, he knew how to secure many curious effects of indefinite and disquieting half-tones. He gave to the bassoons a lugubrious and fantastic character. He experimented with new instruments, small and great. He used the drum, tambour, solo in a dramatic fashion for Jupiter's Oath and Semele. For special situations, by instrumental tone colors, he secures effects not only of dramatic expression, but also of exotism and local color. It is so in the 2 scenes from the 2 Cleopatras, Julia Cesare 1724 and Alexander Balus 1748. But great painter as Handel was, he did not work so much through the brilliancy, variety, and novelty of his tone colors as by the beauty of his designs and his effects of light and shade, with a voluntarily restrained palette, and by satisfying himself with the sober colors of the strings, he yet was able to produce surprising and thrilling effects. Volbach has shown that he had less recourse to the contrast and mixing of instruments than to the division of the same family of instruments into different groups. In the introductory peace movement to his second Esther, 1732, the violins are divided into 5 groups. In the Resurrection, 1708, into 4 divisions. The violas are sometimes divided into 2, the second being reinforced by the 3rd violin, or by the violoncellos. On the other hand, Handel, when he considered it advisable, reduced his instrumental forces by suppressing the viola and the 2nd violin, whose places were taken by the clavecin. All his orchestral art is in the true instinct of balance and economy, which, with the most restricted means in managing a few colors, yet knows how to obtain as powerful impressions as our musicians of today, with their crowded palette. Nothing, then, is more important if we wish to render this music truly than the avoidance of upsetting the equilibrium of the various sections of the orchestra under the pretext of enriching it and bringing it up to date. The worst fault is to deprive it, by a useless surplus of tone colors, of that suppleness and subtlety of nuance which is its principal charm. One is prone to accept too readily the idea that expressive nuance is a privilege of the modern musical art, and that Handel's orchestra knew only the great theatrical contrasts between force and sweetness, or loudness and softness. It is nothing of the kind. The range of Handel's nuances is extremely varied. One finds with him the pianissimo, the piano, the mezzo-piano, the mezzo-forte, un poco più f, un poco f forte, fortissimo. We never find the orchestral crescendo and decrescendo, which hardly appears marked expressly until the time of Jomelli and the school of Mannheim, but there is no doubt that it was practiced long before it was marked in the music. The president of Brosses wrote in 1739 from Rome, "The voices, like the violins, used with light and shade, with unconscious swelling of sound, which augments the force from note to note, even to a very high degree, since its use as a nuance is extremely sweet and touching, and endless examples occur in Handel of long crescendi and diminuendi without its expression being marked in the scores." Another kind of crescendo and diminuendo on the same note was very common in the time of Handel, and his friend Geminiani helped to set the fashion. Volbach, and with him Hugo Riemann, has shown that Geminiani used in the later editions of his first violin sonatas in 1739 and in his violin school in 1751 the two following signs: swelling the sound, diminishing, falling the sound. As Geminiani explains it, the sound ought to commence softly and should swell out in a gradual fashion to about half its value. Then it should diminish to the end. The movement of the bow should continue without interruption. It happens thus that by a refinement of expression, which became a mannerism of the Mannheim school, but which also became a source of powerful contrast with the Beethovenians, the swelling stopped short of its aim, and was followed instead by a sudden piano, as in the following example from the trio sonatas of Geminiani. It is more than probable that the virtuoso players of Handel's orchestra also used this means of expression, though we need not assume that Handel used them as abundantly as Geminiani or as the Mannheim players, whose taste had become doubtless a little affected and exaggerated. But what is certain is that with him, as with Geminiani, and indeed with all the great artists of his time, especially with the Italians and their followers, music was a real discourse and ought to be rendered with inflections as free and as varied as natural speech. How is it possible to realize all the suppleness and subtleties of elocution on the orchestra? To understand this, it is necessary to examine the disposition and placing of the orchestra of that time. It was not, as with us, centralized under the control of a single conductor. Thus, as Seifert tells us, in Handel's time, it was the principle of decentralization which ruled. The choruses had their leaders, who listened to the organ, from which they took their cue, and so sustained the voices. The orchestra was divided into three sections, after the Italian method. Firstly, the concertino, comprising a first and a second violin, and a solo violoncello. Secondly, the concerto grosso, comprising the instrumental choir. Thirdly, the repianists, strengthening the grosso. A picture in the British Museum, representing Handel in the midst of his musicians, depicts the composer seated at the clavier, a cembalo with two keyboards, of which the lid is raised. He is surrounded by the violoncellist, placed at his right-hand side, two violins and two flutes, which are placed just before him, under his eye. The solo singers are also near him, on his left, quite close to the clavecin. The rest of the instrumentalists are behind him, out of his sight. Thus his directions and his glances would control the concertino, who would transmit in their turn the chief conductor's wishes to the concerto grosso, and they in their turn to the repianists. In place of the quasi-military discipline of modern orchestras controlled under the baton of a chief conductor, the different bodies of the Handelian orchestra governed one another with elasticity, and it was the incisive rhythm of the little cembalo which put the whole mass into motion. Such a method avoided the mechanical stiffness of our performances. The danger was rather a certain wobbling without the powerful and infectious willpower of a chief such as Handel, and without the close sympathy of thought which was established between him and his capable subconductors of the concertino and of the grosso. It is this elasticity which should be aimed at in the instrumental works of Handel when they are executed nowadays. We will first take his Concerti Grossi. None of his works are more celebrated and less understood. Handel attached to them a particular value, for he published them himself by subscription, a means which was usual in his day, but which he himself never adopted except under exceptional circumstances. One knows that the kind of Concerti Grossi, which consists chiefly in a dialogue between a group of solo instrumentalists, The concertino and the full body of instruments, concerto grosso, to which is added the cembalo, was, if not invented, at least carried to its perfection and rendered classical by Corelli. The works of Corelli, aided by the efforts of his followers, had become widely known in Europe. Geminiani introduced them into England, and without doubt Handel did not hesitate to profit by the example of Geminiani, who is his friend. But it is much more natural to think that he learnt the concerto grosso at its source at Rome, from Corelli himself during his sojourn there in 1708. Several of his concertos in his Opus 3 date from 1710, 1716, 1722. The same feature shows itself right up to the time of his apprenticeship at Hamburg. In any case, he might have already known the Corellian style, thanks to the propaganda of George Muffat, who spread this style very early in Germany. After Corelli, Locatelli, and especially Vivaldi have singularly transformed the concerto grosso by giving it the free character of program music and by turning it resolutely towards the form of the sonata in 3 parts. But when the works of Vivaldi were played in London in 1723, and the works which aroused such a general enthusiasm became thoroughly known to Handel, it was always to Corelli that he gave the preference, and he was very conservative in certain ways even about him. The form of his concerto, of which the principal movements varied from 4 to 6, oscillated between the suite and the sonata, and even glanced towards the symphonic overture. It is this for which the theorists blame him, and it is this for which I praise him, for he does not seek to impose a uniform cast on his thoughts, but leaves it open to himself to fashion the form as he requires, and the framework varies accordingly, following his inclinations from day to day. The spontaneity of his thoughts, which has already been shown by the extreme rapidity with which the concerti were composed, each in a single day, at a single sitting, and many each week, constitutes the great charm of these works. They are, in the words of Kretschmar, grand impression pictures, translated into a form, at the same time precise and supple, in which the least change of emotion can make itself easily felt. Truly, they are not all of equal value. Their conception itself, which depended in a way on mere momentary inspiration, is the explanation of this extreme inequality. One ought to acknowledge here that the 7th concerto, for example, the one in B-flat major, and the last 3 have but a moderate interest. They are amongst those least played, but to be quite just, we must pay homage to these masterpieces, and especially to the 2nd concerto in F major, which is like a Beethovenian concerto, for we find there some of the spirit of the Bonn master. For Kretschmar, the ensemble calls to mind a beautiful autumn day, the morning where the rising sun pierces its way through the clouds, the afternoon, the joyful walk, the rest in the forest, and finally the happy and belated return. It is difficult, in fact, not to have natural scenes brought before one's eyes in hearing these works. The first Andante Larghetto, which predicts at times the Pastoral Symphony of Beethoven, is a reverie on a beautiful summer's day. The spirit lulls itself with nature's murmur, becomes intoxicated with it, and goes to rest. The tonality rocks between F major to B-flat major and G minor. To render this piece well, it is necessary to give the time plenty of play, often retarding it and following the composer's reverie in a spirit of soft, leisurely abandon. The Allegro in D minor, which follows, is a spirited and delicate little play, a dialogue leaping from the 2 solo violins of the concerto, then on to the concertino and the grosso in turn. There are also certain passages in the bass, robust, rollicking, and rustic, again bring to mind the Pastoral Symphony. The 3rd movement, a Largo in B-flat major, is one of the most intimate of Handel's instrumental pages. After 7 bars of a Largo, in which the concertino alternates dreamily with the tutti, 2 bars adagio, languorously drawn out, cause the reverie to glide into a sort of ecstasy. Then a Larghetto andante e piano breathes out a tender and melancholy song. The Largo is resumed. There is in this little poem a melancholy which seems to revive Handel's personal remembrances. The Allegro ma non troppo, with which it finishes, is, on the contrary, of a jovial feeling, entirely Beethovenish. It sings joyfully as it bounds along in well-marked 3/4 time, with a pizzicato-like rhythm. In the middle of this march, a phrase occurs on the two violins of the concertino, which is like a hymn of reverent and tender gratitude. The fourth concerto in A minor is not less intimate, with its larghetto affettioso, which ought to be played with the rubato, rallentando, and short pauses, its allegro fugue, which spreads out and overshadows all by its powerful tread, and after a largo of antique graveness, the allegro 3/4, which finishes, is the veritable last movement of the Beethoven sonata, romantic, capricious, passionate, and more unrestrained as it approaches the end, accelerando nearly prestissimo, inebriated. But one ought to know especially the sixth concerto in G minor, the most celebrated of all on account of its magnificent musette. It opens with a beautiful larghetto, full of that melancholy, which is one of the dominant sentiments with Handel, and one of the least observed by most people. Melancholy, that is, in the sense of the Melancholia of Dürer or of Beethoven, less agitated, but still profound. We have already encountered it in the second, in the third, and in the fourth concerto. Here it is found in an elegiac monologue, punctuated by pedal points. Then in the dialogues of the concertino and of the tutti responding, like the groups of the ancient classical chorus, the allegro ma non troppo fugue, which follows it, on a twisting chromatic theme, is of the same somber color, but it is the lusty march of the disciplined fugue which dispels the fantastic shadows. Then comes the larghetto, 3/4 time in E-flat major, which Handel calls a musette, and which is one of the most delightful dreams of pastoral happiness. A whole day of poetic and capricious events gradually unrolls itself over the beautiful, echoing refrain. Then the movement slackens, nearly going to sleep, then presses forward again, acquiring a strong, joyous rhythm, a pulsating dance of robust youth, full of bounding life. In the midst of this picture, an episode, rustic and frolicsome, is introduced. Then the broad subject of the introduction recurs with its refrain of quiet joy, nature's own smile. Such works are truly pictures in music. To understand them, it does not suffice to have quick ears. It is necessary to have the eyes to see and the heart to feel. The symphonies of the operas and oratorios of Handel are extremely varied. Still, the Lully form predominates. This form consists, as is well known, of a first slow movement, grave, pompous, and majestic, followed by a second quick movement, full of life and usually in fugal style, with a return to the slow movement for a conclusion. It appears in the Elmira of 1705, and Handel uses it with variations in all the most celebrated works of his maturity, such as in the Messiah and Judas Maccabeus, and even has recourse to it again in his last work of all, The Triumph of Time, 1757. But he does not confine himself entirely to this form alone. The Sinfonia of Rodrigo, 1707, adds to the Lully-like overture a balletto in the Italian style, a veritable suite of dances, jig, saraband, matelot, minuet, bourrée, minuet, grand pascaille. The overture to The Triumph of Time of 1708 is a brilliant concerto where the concertino and the grosso converse in a most entertaining and graceful fashion. The overture to Il Pastor Fido, 1712, is a suite in 8 movements. That of Teseo, 1713, contains 2 largos, each followed by a playful movement of imitation. That of the Passion After Brockus, 1716, consists of a single fugued allegro, which is joined to the first chorus by the link of a declamatory solo on the oboe. The overture to Oxys and Galatea, 1720, is also a single movement. The overture to Giulio Cesare, 1724, is joined on to the first chorus, which is in the form of the third movement, the minuet. The overture to Atalanta, 1736, has a charming sprightliness similar to an instrumental suite for effect, like the firework music, of which we shall speak later. The overture to Saul, 1738, is a veritable concerto for organ and orchestra, and the sonata form is adopted in the first movement. We see then a very marked effort on the part of Handel, particularly in his youth, to vary the form of his overture from one work to another. Even when he uses the Lully type of overture, and he seems to turn towards it more and more in his maturity, he transforms it by the spirit which animates it. He never allows its character to be purely decorative. He introduces therein always expressive and dramatic ideas. If one cannot exactly call the splendid overture to Agrippina, 1709, a concert overture of program music, one cannot deny its dramatic power. The second movement bubbles with life. It is no longer an erudite divertissement, a movement foreign to the action, but it has a tragic character, and the response of the fugue is apparent in the severe and slightly restless subject of the first piece. For conclusion, the slow movement is recalled by a solo on the oboe, which announces it out in the pathetic manner made so well known in certain recitatives of J.S. Bach. Many people have seen in the three movements of the overture to Esther, 1720, a complete program, which Crisander gives thus in detail. Firstly, the wickedness of Haman. Secondly, the complaints of Israel. Thirdly, the deliverance. I will content myself by saying that the ensemble of this symphony is thoroughly in the color and spirit of the tragedy itself, but it is not possible to doubt that, with the overture of Deborah and with that of Belshazzar, that Handel wished to work to a complete program, for of the four movements of the Deborah overture, the second is repeated later on as the chorus of the Israelites, and the fourth as the chorus of Baal's priests. Thus, in his very first pages, he places in miniature, in the overture, the duality of the nations, whose antagonism forms the subject of the drama. It seems also true that the overture to Belshazzar aims at painting the orgy of the feast of Sessach, and the apparition of the divine hand, which wrote the mystic words of fire on the wall. In every case, dramatic intentions are very evident by the three repeats. The interrupted flow of the orchestra is intersected by three short chords, piano, and then after the sudden silence, 3 bars of solemn and soft music are heard like a religious song. We now come to our last class of Handel's instrumental music, to which historians have given far too little attention, and in which Handel shows himself a precursor, and at the same time a model. I refer to the open-air music. This took a prominent place in the English life. The environs of London were full of gardens where, Pepys tells us, vocal and instrumental concerts vied with the voices of the birds. Concerts were given at Vauxhall, at South Lambeth Palace on the Thames, at Ranelagh near Chelsea, about 2 miles from the city, at Marylebone Garden, and Handel was always welcome there. From 1738, the proprietor of Vauxhall, Jonathan Tyre, erected in its gardens a statue of Handel, and this was hardly done when the concerti grossi became the favorite pieces at the concerts of Marylebone, Vauxhall, and Ranelagh. Burney tells us that he often heard them played by numerous orchestras. Handel wrote pieces especially intended for these garden concerts. Generally speaking, he attached little importance to them. They were little symphonies or unpretentious dances, like the hornpipe, composed for the concert of Vauxhall in 1740. An anecdote related by Pohl, and also by Crisander, shows Handel pleasantly engaged on this music, which gave him no trouble at all. But he composed on these lines some works tending towards a much vaster scale. From 1715 or 1717, the famous water music written for the royal procession of barges on the Thames, and the firework music made to illustrate the firework display given in Green Park on April 27, 1749, in celebration of the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle. The water music has a grand serenade in the form of a suite comprising more than 20 movements. It opens with a pompous opera overture. Then come some dialogues with echoes of horns and drums, where the brass and the rest of the orchestra, which are arranged in 2 sections, respond. Then follow happy and soothing songs, dances, a bourrée, a hornpipe, minuets, popular songs, which alternate and contrast with the joyful and powerful fanfares. The orchestra is very nearly the same as in his usual symphonies, except that considerable importance is given to the brass. One even finds in this work certain pieces written in the chamber music style or in the theatrical manner. With the firework music, the character of open-air music is even more definitely asserted, quite as much by the broad style of the piece as by the orchestration, which is confined entirely to the wind instruments. The composition is divided into two parts, an overture which was to be played before the grand firework display, and a number of little pieces to be played during the display, and which corresponded to certain allegorical set pieces. The overture is a sort of stately march in D major, and has some resemblance to the overture of the Ritter ballet, Huntsman's Dance, of Beethoven, and which is, like it, joyful, equestrian, and very sonorous. The shorter movements comprise a bourrée, a largo alla Siciliana, entitled Peace, of a beautiful heroic grace, which lulls itself to sleep, a very sprightly allegro entitled The Rejoicing, and two minuets for conclusion. It is an interesting work for the organizers of our popular fêtes and open-air spectacles to study. If we have said that after 1740 Handel wrote hardly any other instrumental music than the firework music and the two monumental concertos a due cori for two horns, we have the feeling that the last evolution of his thought and instrumental style led him in the direction of music conceived for great masses, wide spaces, and huge audiences. He had always in him a popular vein of thought. I immediately call to mind the many popular inspirations with which his memory was stored, and which vivify the pages of his oratorios. His art, which renewed itself perpetually at this rustic source, had in his time an astonishing popularity. Certain airs from Ottone, Scipione, Ariana, Berenice, and such other of his operas were circulated and vulgarized not only in England, but abroad, and even in France, generally so unyielding to outside influences. It is not only of this popularity, a little banal, of which I wish to speak, which one could not ignore, for it is only a stupid pride and a small heart which denies great value to the art which pleases humble people. What I wish to notice chiefly in the popular character of Handel's music is that it is always truly conceived for the people, and not for an elite dilettante, as was the French opera between Lully and Gluck. Without ever departing from his sovereign ideas of beautiful form, in which he gave no concession to the crowd, he reproduced in a language immediately understanded of the people those feelings in which all could share. This genial improviser, compelled during the whole of his life, a half-century of creative power, to address from the stage a mixed public for whom it was necessary to understand immediately, was like the orators of old, who had the cult of style, an instinct for immediate and vital effect. Our epoch has lost the feeling of this type of art and men, pure artists who speak to the people and for the people, not for themselves or for their confreres. Today the pure artists lock themselves within themselves, and those who speak to the people are most often mountebanks. The free England of the 19th century was, in a certain measure, related to the Roman Republic, and indeed Handel's eloquence was not without relation to that of the epic orators, who sustained in the form their highly finished and passionate discourses, who left their mark on the shuddering crowd of loiterers. This eloquence did on occasion actually thrust itself into the soul of the nation, as in the days of the Jacobite invasion, where Judas Maccabeus incarnated the public feeling. In the first performances of Israel in Egypt, some of the auditors praised the heroic virtues of this music, which could raise up the populace and lead armies to victory. By this power of popular appeal, as by all the other aspects of his genius, Handel was in the robust line of Cavalli and of Gluck, but he surpassed them. Alone, Beethoven has walked in these broader paths and followed along the road which Handel had opened. End of section 8. End of Handel by Romain Rolland, translated by Arthur Eaglefield Hall.